On national parks,
This
forests,
meeting is being recorded.
and public lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on National Heritage Area bills. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements and hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Without objection, Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina, Representative Kai Kahele of Hawaii, Representative John Rutherford of Florida, Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado, and Representative Henry Kular of Texas are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff as soon as possible. Thank you all again for being here today for the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on 12 National Heritage Area bills. I want to thank each of the bill sponsors for their tireless work on behalf of these important sites and their respective communities, and I certainly want to thank the witnesses today who will share their stories about these proposed heritage areas. We are taking on a lot today, so in the interest of time and in hopes of hearing more from our distinguished colleagues and panel, I'm going to keep my opening remarks relatively brief. Since 1984, Congress has established 55 national heritage areas across the country, which have created opportunities for heritage conservation, outdoor recreation, and economic development. National heritage areas are grassroots initiatives that engage communities in heritage preservation by combining natural, cultural, and historical resources into landscapes, ultimately, that will tell important stories of our nation's past. These sites elevate the stories and contributions of diverse communities, increase representation, and tell a more complete American story. They provide opportunities for the federal government to invest in communities, leveraging public-private partnerships to support historical preservation. Above all, heritage areas are community-driven, community-managed initiatives, which I suspect is why they receive such strong bipartisan support here in Congress. However, we are currently approaching an inflection point for these sites. By the end of 2021, 32 of the 55 national heritage areas will lose their funding authorization. Congress must swiftly remedy this looming fiscal cliff. As we do so, we should consider the future of the Heritage Area Program. The breadth of the bills that we'll consider today demonstrate, for example, the consistent interest from American communities in having their resources protected as national heritage areas. I very much look forward to hearing those stories and to learning more about these proposed sites. But in the long term, the piecemeal system of establishment and individual authorization is no longer working for heritage areas or for the Park Service. And it's past time, in my view, that Congress establish a clear, consistent system for the administration and oversight of heritage areas. And I certainly look forward to working with the minority on the committee towards that end. We need to provide certainty to NPS and to the local coordinating entities that they partner with, that Congress will continue to lift up these important resources. I believe Representative Tonko's bill is an effective way to achieve these goals, and I look forward to certainly hearing more from him about his efforts. I also want to talk about how the growing heritage area program fits within the full scope of the National Park Service's responsibilities. Heritage areas serve an important role in highlighting our shared history, but in an era of declining staffing and budgets, we need to ensure that we're providing NPS with the resources that it needs to adequately manage them. So once again, I want to thank each of you for being here today, and I look forward to our conversation. And with that, I'd now like to yield back and recognize Ranking Member Fulcher for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would first like to point out that the Today's activities have been a bit lopsided, or so far this session's activities have been just a bit lopsided. We got 10 bills sponsored by our Democrat colleagues and just 2 sponsored by Republicans. And the 10 Democrat bills we're considering today are double the total amount of Republican bills we've received hearings on for the first 6 months of Congress. And that's double. And so just want to point out that considering only 5 Republican bills in the 6 months in Congress, it's just a poor statistic. And I hope that we can rectify the unbalanced nature of this hearing by including additional Republican bills during the subcommittee's hearing in July. I'd also like to note the majority is holding a hearing on national heritage areas today instead of prioritizing other important topics such as forest health and the implementation of the Great Outdoors Act, additional hearings on additional administration's fiscal year 22 budget. A few things could be more urgent than ensuring we are wisely stewarding billions of dollars of taxpayer money to fix the iconic treasures of our national parks. Now I'd like to turn attention to the topic of today's hearing. The National Park Service currently oversees 55 national heritage areas intended to commemorate, conserve, and promote important natural, scenic, historic, cultural, and recreational resources. In 1984, President Reagan signed into law the first national heritage area, the Illinois and Michigan Canal National Heritage Area. In this dedication speech, President Reagan referred to national heritage areas as a new kind of national park that married heritage conservation, recreation, and economic development. Unlike lands within the national park system, which are federally owned and managed, lands within national heritage areas are primarily in state, local, or private ownership, or a combination thereof. National heritage areas can be an effective tool to establish public-private partnerships for conservation and historic preservation without adding more land to the federal estate. We can't continue to add units to the national park system in perpetuity, or we'll risk continuing to fall further and further behind on our maintenance obligations. In creating national heritage areas, however, we must be careful to ensure that private property rights are protected. Fiscal year 21 appropriation for National Park Service assistance to national heritage areas was nearly $24 million. Congress originally intended for national heritage areas to receive federal seed money and progress to a point where appropriations would no longer be required. In fact, in 1994, during the House floor debate on national heritage areas, the National Park Subcommittee Chairman, Bruce Vento, Democrat from Minnesota, stated the amount of support is limited, and there is a limit to the length of time or the amount of money the federal government can be in a heritage area. In 10, excuse me, in 10 years, we'll be out of here. Then they were on their own, and we all get the benefit of that conservation. Despite this clear assurance, national heritage areas dating back to 1984 continue to request and receive annual federal support. In recent years, both the Obama and Trump administrations supported reducing appropriations for national heritage areas and urged Congress to return to the original concept of national heritage areas by promoting self-sufficiency. This year, the funding authorizations for 30 of the existing 55 national heritage areas are set to expire on September 30th. Congress must address these expirations in a way that encourages national heritage areas to become less dependent on federal appropriations, either through a gradual phase out of federal funding or by establishing a competitive grant program for management entities to compete for federal funds. I look forward to hearing some of the new and innovative ideas for our national heritage areas during this hearing today and working with my colleagues across the aisle to address these reauthorizations in bipartisan fashion. I'd also like to highlight the 2 Republican bills on today's hearing. First, we have H.R. 2107, the nation's oldest port National Heritage Area Act by Congressman Rutherford of Florida. This bill would establish the nation's oldest port National Heritage Area composed of 4 natural watersheds across 4 Northeast Florida counties. Its boundaries would include the port of Jacksonville at the mouth of the St. Johns River and historic St. Augustine, the nation's oldest city, founded in 1565. We'll also be discussing H.R. 3616, the Bear River National Heritage Area Studies Act, sponsored by a subcommittee colleague, Congressman Blake Moore of Utah. This bill requires the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a study assessing the suitability and feasibility of designating the Bear River National Heritage Area in northern Utah and southern Idaho. The Bear River area straddles the Utah-Idaho border where the Great Basin and Rocky Mountains meet, and the area is home to the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. Golden Spike National Historic Park, numerous Mormon history sites, the Oregon Trail, and abundant natural beauty. Idaho does not currently have any national heritage areas, so I'm looking forward to seeing the results of the study, and I commend Congressman Moore for his work on the legislation. And finally, this summer, millions of acres will burn because of the poor management practices, not climate change, and the never-ending environmental litigation. While we discuss these national heritage areas, it is crucial to remember the disaster our federal forests and lands face because of lack of logging and grazing. With that, I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for being with us today and look forward to the testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member yields back. I'd now like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills that they have sponsored. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use quote stage view or grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McKee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for covering today's important legislative hearing on national heritage areas. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, including Dr. Alexandra Sutton Lawrence, who is here on behalf of the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative. Dr. Lawrence, thank you for your critical work with the collaborative to preserve and protect the history of the culture of the Great Dismal Swamp. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to join you to speak in support of my legislation, the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Area Act, which is being considered this afternoon. The Great Dismal Swamp is an area of immense environmental, cultural, historical significance for Virginia, North Carolina, and the entire nation. The swamp has served as home for Native peoples and wildlife for thousands of years and as a refuge for freedom seekers along the Underground Railroad. Designated a National Wildlife Refuge in 1974, the swamp plays an important ecological role for the region. It once boasted an ancient forest of over 1 million acres in size and is now home to one of only 2 natural lakes in Virginia. Conserving and protecting the swamp, its diverse wildlife and vegetation, and its rich heritage is essential. That is why I introduced the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Act. This legislation, which I was proud to lead alongside Representatives Butterfield, Loria, and Scott, would direct the Secretary of the Interior to assess the suitability and feasibility of designating the Great Dismal Swamp as a national heritage area. Mr. Chairman, as we'll discuss further today, national heritage areas are public-private partnerships designated by Congress for the protection and preservation of resources and stories that are both regionally unique and nationally significant. Through these public-private partnerships, national heritage areas support historic preservation, conservation, recreation, tourism, and educational projects. My bill begins this important process by initiating a study, which I hope and expect will lead to the eventual designation of the Dismal as a national heritage area. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for including my legislation during today's legislative hearing. The Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Act is a top priority for me and many of my constituents. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Sutton Lawrence later today about the importance of this legislation to the continued preservation and protection of the Great Dismal Swamp. And I look forward to working alongside you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of my colleagues to pass this legislation into law. Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. McEachin. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, the House Majority Whip, Mr. Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and the members of the committee for allowing me to be here today. And I want to welcome Mr. Douglas Bostic. who you will be hearing from later on today. Mr. Chairman, I recognize the significance of the many programs and initiatives that fall within your jurisdiction. As someone who studies history every day, I am also aware of the tremendously positive impact this committee's work has on our country and the preservation of American history. As President Harry Truman once said, the only thing new in the world is a history you do not know. I welcome this opportunity to testify in support of legislation I have introduced to provide a more robust appreciation of the Southern campaign of the American Revolutionary War. The American victory at Kings Mountain in South Carolina was once described by a British commander as, and I'm quoting him, the first link in a chain of evils that ended in the total loss of America, end of quote. Mr. Chairman, when we hear the story of the American Revolution, we don't often hear of the war's Southern campaign or applaud the dramatic impact it had on the revolution. Significant American victories in the Carolinas between 1775 and 1783, such as at Kings Mountain and at Guilford Courthouse, paved the way for the America's final victory in the war for independence. The legislation we are discussing here today seeks to tell this under-recognized story and acknowledge the enduring significance of the Southern campaign on our nation's history by establishing the Southern Campaign of the Revolution National Heritage Corridor. In 2014, the National Park Service conducted a National Heritage Area Stability Feasibility Study, which concluded that the military events in the Carolinas substantially influenced the eventual American victory in the Revolution. The study also found that the American victory in the Revolution foretold momentous changes for Native Americans and African Americans in the Carolinas. The British and American armies promised enslaved African Americans their freedom to enlist. Black soldiers fought in integrated combat units in a number of backcountry locations throughout the Southern campaign. Most African Americans who could document their service to the American Army would indeed earn their freedom at the end of the war. African American soldiers would not be provided the standard of liberty enjoyed by these soldiers until 200 years later, when the American military was officially integrated. This bill reflects the input of communities across South Carolina and North Carolina who expressed unanimous support for the creation of the National Heritage Area. I am honored that the entire South Carolina congressional delegation has co-sponsored this bill. This legislation was initially proposed by South Carolina Congressman John Spratt, and I'm pleased to see this legislation finally making progress in the House. I commend the American Battlefield Trust for their help in forming this process and the University of South Carolina for its willingness to serve as a management entity for this heritage corridor. It is a personal mission of mine to increase public awareness of and appreciation for natural, historical, scenic, and cultural resources associated with the Southern campaign. I am convinced that the creation of the Heritage Corridor will add significant economic benefit to rural communities across the Carolinas by drawing visitors to the battlefields and historical landmarks that are located in these communities. For over a decade, Congress and the National Park Service have worked towards creating this Heritage Corridor in the Carolinas. It is long past time to make this a reality. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to participate in today's proceedings, and I will answer any questions you may have.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Clyburn. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Can you hear me?
We can.
And Ranking Member Fulcher, thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee and for including my bill, H.R. 1316, the National Heritage Area Act, in today's important hearing. There are currently 55 National Heritage Areas, as you've indicated, in active operation in communities across America, sites of cultural, historical, or natural significance that help tell our unique and diverse American story. In New York's 20th Congressional District, these legendary sites include the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor and the Maurice D. Hinchey Hudson River Valley National Heritage Corridor. For decades, these sites have opened wide the doors of economic opportunity and community engagement for New York's capital region and beyond. America's heritage areas are major contributors to cultural tourism. The United States Department of Commerce reviewed this question and estimates that heritage areas contribute a whopping $192 billion to our national economy every year. These sites are a powerful leverage of public funds, with public and private partnerships matching an average of $5.50 for every $1 in federal funding, a nearly 6-to-1 return on investment for the American taxpayer. Not only do national heritage areas support jobs and foster economic growth through tourism and other community activities, they also instill a deeper sense of places we live and travel. Visitors experience these sites in ways that connect us with America's rich, diverse history and ground that understanding in the deep and often hidden roots of our own communities. Currently, there is no standardized process for administering national heritage areas, which has allowed for sometimes inconsistent oversight and management, a longstanding concern expressed by the National Park Service and others. My bipartisan National Heritage Area Act, H.R. 1316, establishes for the first time standard criteria for designating new national heritage areas, as well as creating a rigorous process for maintaining existing national heritage areas and an oversight structure that will allow these popular sites to continue serving their communities independently while supporting the surrounding economies. H.R. 1316 would establish a clear, consistent statutory framework for the National Park Service's role in administering the National Heritage Area Program, standardize the process for studying and establishing new heritage areas, modernize the program to allow for long-term sustainability, address concerns regarding accountability by creating an evaluation process for existing heritage areas, and end the current system of piecemeal reauthorizations through a 15-year authorization for all existing national heritage areas. Without these reforms to streamline the existing system, national heritage areas have to expand significant resources pursuing other more isolated funding extensions and reauthorizations, often with last-minute congressional action. This stopgap model is putting significant pressure on local administrators and the coordinating entities that run these sites, taking time and resources away from the important work of fixing and restoring these sites in ways that help open our eyes to this diverse series of stories, open doors for greater community engagement, and generally preserve these important resources. In some cases, these precious local historic sites have fallen or are in danger of falling into serious disrepair. So the current piecemeal system makes little sense from a congressional perspective as well. The funding authorizations for 32 of America's heritage areas are set to expire at the end of this fiscal year, meaning that without swift, decisive congressional action, these sites will lose much of their ability to preserve the important resources they were designated to protect and promote cultural tourism, an important economic driver for many of America's local communities as we emerge from the shadow of this pandemic. President John F. Kennedy, in his 1962 State of the Union address, said, "We are all trustees for the American people, custodians of the American heritage. We are the keepers of that heritage, and maintaining and preserving these treasured sites is more important than ever. Our work to pursue a bright and equitable future for every American requires that we also be active stewards of our past. National heritage areas connect us, and perhaps more importantly, connect future generations with the voices and places that have shaped who we are as Americans. These sites deliver more than just a significant economic return. They help us reveal the diverse and sometimes hidden gems of our cultural heritage and fill us with a sense of place that connects us to the rich, diverse history of our regions and the deep roots of our communities. And they help bring our complex history to life. So I thank my colleague, Congressman McKinley, for his partnership on this bill, for our shared work supporting national heritage areas across the nation. And once again, I thank the chair and the members of this committee for holding today's hearing. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from the from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Blaskin.
Thank you so much, Chairman Neguse. Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher, for the opportunity to present my views on HR 1424, which is the St. Croix National Heritage Area. My bill would designate the island of St. Croix, located in the Virgin Islands of the United States, as a National Heritage Area site. My efforts for this designation are preceded by nearly 20 years of tireless work on the part of many individuals, community groups, and local stakeholders in my district. This National Heritage Area designation is being proposed pursuant to a congressionally directed feasibility study that was completed by the National Park Service more than 10 years ago, in September of 2010. This study was initiated by the National Park Service after it was included in the National Heritage Areas Act of 2006 by my predecessor, the Honorable Dr. Donna Christensen. The unique natural, historic, and cultural resources of St. Croix represent distinct aspects of the heritage of America that have been determined by the National Park Service to be worthy of recognition and provide outstanding recreational and educational opportunities. St. Croix is where Columbus first arrived in the Virgin Islands on his second voyage to the New World in 1493, and the only place in the United States where he actually set foot. It was also the home of one of the drafters of our Constitution and the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Today, the island has two distinct towns, Christiansted, built in 1734, and Frederiksted, built in 1752. Christiansted is the one-time Danish West Indies capital and now a National Historic Site. Just off the coast of Christiansted is Buck Island, the only U.S. underwater national monument. Frederiksted on St. Croix is known for its shoreline, deep port, and its fiery people. The island has become a popular tourist destination with its increased number of historic and cultural resources. St. Croix has nearly 50 listings on the National Register of Historic Places, with more sites with potential. After nearly 4 years of community engagement and examination of the merits of a National Historic Heritage Area designation by the National Park Service, the Park Feasibility Study team concluded that the island of St. Croix meets the evaluation criteria for designation as a National Heritage Area based on the applicable National Heritage Area Feasibility Study Guideline. As described through the study, St. Croix has contributed in substantial ways to our American national heritage. It also contains an assemblage of natural, cultural, historic, and scenic resources that make up a nationally distinctive landscape. The rich and varied stories about St. Croix lend themselves to an intriguing set of themes that connect people to the various heritage resources of the island. 5 themes were developed: early cultures, slavery and emancipation, the 7 flags of St. Croix, geography and natural environment, and lastly, modern-day St. Croix. These themes create building blocks which illustrate the ways in which the individual resources of St. Croix connect and contribute to the overall heritage of our nation. Furthermore, the designation of St. Croix as a National Heritage Area has strong support from the public and from community stakeholders, and there is local capacity and commitment to undertake the responsibility of managing this area. Therefore, this bill would complete the work that has been done for this National Heritage Area designation in a way that is consistent with the procedural traditionally set forth for such site designation, as lastly enacted in the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation, Management, and Recreation Act of 2019. As concluded by the National Park Service study on St. Croix, there is not one single thing that sets St. Croix apart, but rather an assemblage of authentic, natural, cultural, historic, and scenic features that celebrate the heritage of the Crucian people. I have and would like to submit for the record comments that have been received from the University of the Virgin Islands School of Agriculture, the St. Croix Chamber of Commerce, the St. Croix Unified for Community, Culture, Environment, and Economic Development, Succeed, St. Croix Foundation for Community Development, the Virgin Islands Trail Alliance, the Trust for the Virgin Islands Lands, Persian Heritage and National Tourism Incorporated, Chant, the St. Croix Environmental Association, and the Virgin Islands Conservation Society, along with our governor, a statement from Governor Albert Bryant Jr. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Chairman DeGoose and Ranking Member Fulcher and subcommittee members. Thank you for taking the time to hear my testimony today. I have to tell you, I'm thankful the committee is considering my legislation of H.R. 2107, which is the nation's oldest Port National Heritage Area Act. And this bill will actually establish a national heritage area in Northeast Florida, running from down the Atlantic coast from the mouth of the St. Mary's River, which is the Florida-Georgia state line, all the way down to Flagler County, just below the city of St. Augustine. This area is referred to by many as the first coast of Florida. This stretch of Florida is home to our nation's oldest city, some beautiful landscapes and literally thousands of years of history. In fact, it's a very unique and historical area of our nation. Establishing a national heritage area here would preserve and celebrate the diverse groups that have really called the First Coast home, including from the Native American tribes of Northeast Florida to the settlers in St. Augustine, which is, again, the nation's oldest city. It also involves Fort Mose, which is the first settlement in America of free African Americans. So it really is a very unique area. It is a mosaic of cultures and has also been shaped by a very impressive maritime heritage. This bill would support public-private partnerships that promote conservation, historic preservation, recreation, and heritage tourism. And it's really a culmination of years of grassroots work, literally years, going on 10, I believe. Later today, you're going to hear from, in fact, Kathy Fleming, who's the executive director of the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum, who really has spearheaded this effort. She's worked tirelessly since 2007 with other members of the nation's oldest port area alliance to actually get local buy-in for this heritage area application and designation. The alliance's efforts have been very successful. The area is supported by mayors, city councils, county commissions, local chambers of commerce, and many other organizations within the First Coast. These grassroots groups have collaborated and worked with the National Park Service to create and complete a very impressive feasibility study that outlines the history of the area and its many historic sites, including hundreds of shipwrecks that are off the Northeast Florida coast. The bill has extensive support in areas encompassed in the NHA. And last Congress, we actually received very good bipartisan support from the Florida delegation. And it's my hope that this committee will take up this important bipartisan bill that will create jobs, support the local economy, and preserve the stories of those that have inhabited and built Florida's First Coast. And I'm happy to take any questions, but with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case.
Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, my subcommittee colleagues, aloha, and mahalo for the opportunity to testify in support of my bill, the Ka'ena Point National Heritage Area Act, co-introduced by my colleague, Representative Kahele, which would direct the Department of the Interior to study whether Ka'ena Point on the island of Oahu should be designated as a national heritage area. Our National Heritage Area system, of course, ensures that our federal government commemorates significant natural, scenic, historic, and cultural resources and offers critical support to our local communities to conserve these areas for present and future use. NHAs are inherently collaborative entities which bring federal, state, and local governments and communities together to celebrate and preserve our heritage the right way. While Congress has established 55 NHAs since 1984, there are none in my state of Hawaii. My bill, H.R. 1908, would provide the first step in designating Ka'ena Point on the western tip of Oahu as a National Heritage Area. This 3-year study would simply evaluate whether Ka'ena Point holds valuable resources that reflect our country's heritage that are worthy of conservation and recognition. It would lay the groundwork for Congress to make the final decision on a heritage area designation. For me, Ka'ena Point is a perfect candidate for NHA designation. It is home to a rich cultural history, including one of Hawaii's most sacred places, Leina Akauhane, a leaping place of souls. According to tradition, the Leina is where the spirits of the recently dead leap from this realm to the next. Ka'ena Point is truly sacred to many Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians, and holds a unique indigenous heritage that deserves to be preserved for continued cultural and traditional use. Beyond its clear cultural value, the area is also environmentally significant as one of the last few remaining and easily accessible wilderness areas on Oahu. Ka'ena Point is one of the last intact sand dune ecosystems in the main Hawaiian Islands and is home to a number of endemic and endangered species such as the Hawaiian monk seal, Laysan albatross, and the ohai flower. Ka'ena is a perfect example of Hawaii's unique and fragile ecosystem, which we strive every day to protect and preserve. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, my bill would ensure the full collaboration of the local community in preserving the tradition and pristine nature of Ka'ena Point. Our community, our local organizations, fishers, hikers, and neighborhood groups would be engaged throughout the study process. And if the area is eventually designated as an NHA, they would be integral partners in the area's management. Mahalo again for the opportunity to speak on behalf of my bill. I also want to thank Congressman Kahele, whose district is home to Ka'ena Point, for his support in advancing this legislation. I also want to take this opportunity to encourage the Commission to support Congressman Kahele's bill, H.R. 1925, which I am honored to co-sponsor, to similarly study the benefits of another incredible possibility for National Heritage Area designation in South Kona on the island of Hawaii. The South Kona coastline, from Hawaii's last fishing village in Miloli'i to the southernmost point in the 50 states at Kalai, retains so much of the unique cultural, historic, and physical essence of the real Hawaii. It deserves federal support equally. Mahalo again, and I look forward to working with the committee to advance both of these measures, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from the great state of Texas, Mr. Kular. Is the gentleman with us from Texas?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to the ranking member also, and to the members of the committee. Thank you for having me here to discuss my legislation, H.R. 2359, to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a study to assess the suitability and feasibility of designating certain lands as the Los Caminos del Rio National Heritage Corridor. I also like to thank my community witness, Christopher Rincon, Director of the River Piers Foundation, for being here today to testify about this legislation. I want to say thank you. If I can give you some background on the region, the Lower Rio Grande is a large and diversified landscape characterized by the historical land uses and architecture and social traditions and ecosystems. The layering of successive periods can be experienced as you travel through this corridor. For example, there are remnant sable palm grove forests that can give you a sense of the landscape as it was seen by the early Spanish explorers in 1520. Land surveys still reflect Spanish land distribution patterns of the mid-18th century in the form of porciones. They're long tracts of land perpendicular to the river. Early ranching forts with wall compounds and troneras, which are gun ports, still exist as the ore of some river communities, as well as in isolated areas. Military forts, battlefields related to the Mexican-American and the U.S. Civil War, as well as sites related to the Mexican political and revolutionary upheavals, are dispersed throughout the region. 19th century river trade and the coming of the railroads spurred tremendous growth and development seen along the river. Mechanized irrigation transformed the semi-arid landscape into today's commercial and agricultural empires. The U.S.-Mexico border itself is a significant landscape feature and theme. Tejano festivals, interchange of Spanish and English language, Tex-Mex cuisine, bullfighting, religious practices include saints' days, cemetery decorations, observations of mariachi, music, and so many other things that gives you a sense of being on the border, a land apart from its own customs and distinct identity. The border or the boundary gives to the Los Caminos River has been defined by those cultural and geographical themes and characteristics. The Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, as it's called from the Mexican side, has always been the lifeblood of the region. Therefore, the concentration of resources naturally lie within a narrow swath along both sides of the river. Because the Los Caminos del Rio Heritage Corridor is expected to have far-reaching impact, the corridor boundary is expanded beyond the river itself to include 6 Texas counties: Webb, Zapata, Star, Hidalgo, Cameron, and Jamal. In conclusion, I would say that overall, the Los Caminos del Rio region is one of the most ecologically diverse areas in North America, with a flourishing blend of history and culture. Recognizing the region as a national heritage area will boost the local economy, preserve the South Texas landmarks for future generation. I'm pleased to carry this legislation and remain committed to championing the heritage of the Rio Grande Valley by helping to conserve the historical of South Texas. And with that, I say thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and the members of the committees. I look forward to working with you all on this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's 3:43 in the morning here on Guam. I just got off of a 19-hour flight, and it's like maybe about about a little over 6 hours since I just got off the plane. And I have to be actually at a change of command ceremony in about another 6 hours. So, we're really we're really burning the midnight oil out here. But we're doing so because the work of this committee and the work of this being conducted in this particular hearing is of utmost importance to this country. What we're doing here and what we're discussing here with these various national heritage areas is we're talking about how we're going to preserve and promote what makes America special. And for me on my end here, we have our particular bill, HR 2889, that's seeking to conduct a national heritage area study out here in the territory of Guam. And as I listened to all of the testimony that was previously discussed, from our ranking member, the respectable Representative Fulcher, who mentioned in 1984 that this was when the first national heritage area was established. That was 37 years ago. My colleague, my fellow territorial colleague mentioned that they had their study done in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2006. That was 15 years ago. And here we are, Guam has not had a national heritage area study. And I'm humbly asking this committee and my colleagues to please support my bill so that we can finally have one done. And the reason why we're seeking to have one done is because we have so much significance in the American story out here in Guam, and we want to be able to tell that story to the American people. We also want to be able to tell that story to all of our visitors and our neighbors out here in Asia. On Guam, we have over 11 miles of Pacific Ocean coral reef gardens that is nowhere to be found anywhere else in this country. On Guam, we have over 26 hectares of rainforest that is a very rare natural occurrence in the United States. We have the oldest society of Austronesian migration out here on Guam of the ancient Chamorro people, the story of the indigenous people on Guam that is just underrepresented in this country. Guam was also occupied by the Spanish since 1521. This is our 500th anniversary of colonialism on Guam, going all the way back to Spanish times in 1521. That story is not told. We have ruins of Spanish bridges and Spanish palaces and Spanish facilities out here that are not receiving the support that really should be received for something of such historical significance to this country, especially because Guam was a territory that became a part of the United States as a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898. We also have a deeply significant history in World War II, with Guam being the only American soil that was actually occupied by the Japanese. And we have so many historic sites out here as a result of that occupation. From the Menengan Death March that saw the death of thousands of Chamorro people. We lost 14,000 Chamorros, a very, very significant number of Americans who died in these death marches. That is just very underrepresented in this country. Guam also actually happens to have a piece of World War I history as well, with the sinking of the Cormoran in our waters out here, just off the coast. And very, very interestingly, the sinking of the Cormoran in World War I and the sinking of the Tokai Maru in World War II, you literally can dive that site and touch both sunken vessels. The only place in the entire world where you can do that for both World War I and World War II. I mean, there's so many stories to tell, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. There's so much significance out here in our Pacific Island territory. And all we're asking for is that we do our duty to study these things so we can properly recognize them as national heritage areas. And that's what we're looking to do in HR 2889. I humbly ask my colleagues to please move this legislation forward. Let's get this study done and let's recognize these incredibly significant ecological, environmental, and historical components of our American history. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We certainly hope the gentleman will have an opportunity to get some sleep, recognizing that very busy and difficult travel schedule. And with that, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from the state of Utah, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman Agus, and to Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Members Westerman and Fulcher for holding this hearing today, allowing me to testify on my legislation, HR 3616, the Bear River Heritage Area Study Act. Yeah, Utah is best known for its painted desert landscapes and national parks like Arches and Zion. However, the Bear River Basin, which is located in northern Utah and stretches into southeast Idaho, is a lush oasis in an otherwise arid region. From fur trapping to railroads, this area has played a key role in settling and ongoing development in the American West. The Bear River area has long been an important part of Utah and Idaho's shared history. Native American tribes, including the Shoshone and Ute, called this area home due to its abundant wildlife and favorable weather. Later, explorers and adventurers, fur trappers, and Mormon pioneers called the valley home. The trappers' practice of stowing beaver pelts and other goods in caches for safe storage inspired residents to call part of the region Cache Valley, one of the most prized areas in my district. In the mid-19th century, settlers from the Salt Lake Valley moved north and began building homes in the Bear River area. The area's natural water supply makes it ideal for farming, and it quickly became home to a thriving frontier towns. Generations of family farms in northern Utah and southwest Idaho can trace their origins to these early days. One of the seminal moments in our nation's history happened in the Bear River area in 1869. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed with the driving of the Golden Spike, seen here right on my lapel, there it is, at Promontory Summit. This helped prepare our great nation onto the world stage, connecting our economy to continents far and wide and dramatically reducing the time and cost of coast-to-coast travel, a very significant event, as we all would agree. Today, the Bear River area spans 7 counties in Utah and Idaho and contains a variety of historically and culturally significant sites that draw hundreds of thousands of visitors to the region each year from around the world. I was proud to introduce the Bear River Heritage Area Study Act with my good friend Congressman Simpson from Idaho to help elevate this important region. This bill authorizes the Secretary of Interior to conduct a study to determine its sustainability or its suitability for designation as a national heritage area. The study would identify whether the region has cultural resources that represent distinctive aspects of our culture and whether they are worthy of conservation. I believe that the Bear River region meets these qualifications. The proposed study would also ensure that local stakeholders, including residents, businesses, and tribal and local government organizations, have developed a sound financial plan outlining the roles and responsibilities of the participants in the heritage area. I'm proud that this bill enjoys significant local support in both Utah and Idaho from the Bear River Association of Governments, the Cache Valley Chamber of Commerce, Southeast Idaho High Country Tourism, and many others. To demonstrate this support, Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter 18 letters of support into the record from local stakeholders.
Sorry, without objection.
There you go. A nod without objection. Thank you. Grateful for these stakeholders for their invaluable input. Above all else, national heritage areas, they tell the quiet stories of our nation, stories of places that have seen our best and worst, and of regions that are critically important to telling our American story. From Bear Lake to the Bear River Massacre site, from Golden Spike to the American West Heritage Center, and countless destinations in between, the Bear River Basin is home to many of these stories. I urge my colleagues on this committee to join with local stakeholders and to support this important bill. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to speak, and I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Kahele.
Aloha, Chair Nagus and Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the committee, and honored guests. I have a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to show you and to take you to the proposed South Kona National Heritage Area. And I want to mahalo you for the opportunity to testify in support of my bill, House Resolution 1925, and also thank my friend and my colleague, Congressman Ed Case, for joining me as an original co-sponsor. I'm also a strong supporter of Congressman Case's House Resolution 1908, as he had briefed earlier. But it is with great excitement that I stand before you today to showcase one of the most beautiful and precious and pristine areas in the state of Hawaii. This legislation will help preserve and protect some of Hawaii's most immaculate shorelines while enhancing economic activities connected to our visitor, coffee, macadamia, flower, and tropical fruit industries. Designating the area as a national heritage area will benefit the economy and will protect the alluring beauty of Hawaii Island and enhance the vibrancy of Hawaii's multicultural and national and native Hawaiian communities. Next slide. The state of Hawaii, as you probably know, Chair, is comprised of 8 main Hawaiian islands, 8 major islands. They are from Ni'ihau all the way in the upper left corner down to the island of Hawaii, otherwise known as the Big Island, where the National Heritage Area proposed site is located. Next slide. The South Kona National Heritage Area is located on the southwestern region of the island of Hawaii. This unique region boasts numerous intact and significant Native Hawaiian cultural sites that date to pre-Western contact, 10 miles of undeveloped coastline, and intact marine and terrestrial ecosystems that support dozens of threatened and endangered plant and animal species. Many Native Hawaiian residents share a strong connection to this place through generations of stewardship, cultural practices, and traditions. Next slide. Along the coastline, there is Honomalino Bay, Kapua Bay, Puhui Bay, and Kalai, otherwise known as South Point. Puhui Bay is one of the few untouched places in Hawaii. This area is home to a number of historic trails, heiau, or sacred sites and temples, petroglyphs, and other cultural features. And Puhui Bay is also a prime nesting point, an area for the endangered hawksbill sea turtle. In the north, Honolulu is a black sand beach and is one of the most picturesque sites on the island of Hawaii. Next slide. Each of those 4 locations are depicted there. Honolulu Bay in the upper left corner, Kapua Bay on the right-hand side, Pahui Bay on the left, and Kalai, otherwise known as South Point, on the southernmost tip of the continental United States. This area at Kalai is already a registered National Historic Landmark District and is a site of one of the earliest settlements in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, within this geographical area, like I mentioned earlier, are petroglyphs. These are carvings by the ancient Hawaiians that drew pictures into the rocks. There are heiau, otherwise known as ancient temples, burial sites, caves, and ancient trails and house sites, and a fully preserved holua slide, or a Hawaiian sled at Ahole near Kapua Bay. Next slide. The South Kona Wilderness Area, if you can go to the next slide, is proposed by the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs in the 1970s. This area was established in 2011 by the state of Hawaii for the preservation of the culturally and historically rich South Kona area. Today, these lands are administered by the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources. These lands already include several of the areas that we are proposing in the National Heritage Area, such as Honolulu Bay, Okoi, and Kapua. Next slide. Traversing the South Kona National Heritage Area is the 175-mile Ala Kahakai National Historic Trail. This is a trail that runs more than half of the coastline on the island of Hawaii. The trail enables and enabled in the past the gathering of food and water and harvesting of materials and shelter. And it is literally a stone trail that goes for at least 100 miles from North Kona all the way down to South Kona. And you can walk it right in between sharp and very rugged and barren lava fields on the South Kona coastline. Next slide. Cultural practices are very important in Hawaii, and traditions are very important as well. I talked about the holua slide or the lava sledding at Kapua Bay, but in Hawaii, traditional and customary gathering rites and those cultural subsistence practices are codified in the Hawaii State Constitution. These rights include access to the ocean to harvest the bounties of the sea. Next slide. The community sponsor for this proposed National Heritage Area that the Department of Interior will be able to work with is Pa'apono Miloli'i. This organization was formed in 1980, over 40 years ago. It's fully incorporated as a 501c3 in 2004, primarily for the purpose of preserving and protecting these special areas and the culture and historical history of this area. This organization has performed federal, state, and county EISs. They've partnered with many other organizations throughout Hawaii, including at the federal level, NOAA and the Housing and Urban Development. Next slide. Community support is very important. You're going to hear from one community organization today, the organization called the Kona Kohala Chamber of Commerce, but it is with great joy that community voices have expressed support for the South Kona National Heritage Area, and I'm very grateful for their support to include not just the Kona Kohala Chamber of Commerce, but the Ala Kahakai Trail Association, the Hawaii Islands Land Trust, the Laopua Homestead Association, the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii, the Trust for Public Land, and the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Further, I'm committed, I'm sure as all the members are in these proposed National Heritage Areas, to a fully transparent process and making sure that all local stakeholders are aware of the process, that they're able to participate in these public hearings, that they can share their comments, and that we can get and answer any of their questions. Last slide. Finally, an olelo no'eau, or a Hawaiian proverb in Hawaii, a very famous one, is "Ohe hana nui ke aloi'a," which means, Mr. Chairman, no task is too big when done together by all. And so on behalf of Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District, thank you for giving me an opportunity to present my testimony on the proposed South Kona National Heritage Area. And I humbly ask for the support of the committee members and the committee. Thank you so much. Mahalo.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman yields back. I can assure the gentleman that that is certainly the first time I have seen a PowerPoint presentation from a member testifying on a bill. So congratulations, and certainly a very effective presentation, and we look forward to consideration of your bill today. We will now transition to panel 2. I want to thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have a 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. The chair will now recognize, for purposes of the second panel, Ms. Joy Beasley, Associate Director of Cultural Resources, Partnerships, and Science at the National Park Service.
Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the views of the Department of the Interior on several National Heritage Area bills. I'd like to submit our full statement for the record and summarize the department's views. The department recognizes that every National Heritage Area established by Congress serves an important role in preserving, interpreting, and promoting the unique characteristics of the area it encompasses. National Heritage Areas foster stewardship of our nation's heritage without creating new park units. Through public-private partnerships, heritage areas support preservation, conservation, recreation, heritage tourism, and educational projects. And while each of the 55 areas that have been designated by Congress is established in perpetuity, most have a funding sunset date 15 years after the date of enactment and a funding limit of $10 million. Congress has typically extended these authorizations. This year, 30 of the 55 National Heritage Areas will require action in order to be eligible to receive funds in FY 2022. HR 1316 would recognize National Heritage Areas as a system rather than solely as individual entities. The department supports establishing a statutory framework for the National Park Service's role in administering the National Heritage Area program and explicitly providing authority for the National Park Service's important ongoing responsibilities, as this bill would do. We recommend clarifying if the bill's provisions for conducting studies, approving management plans, performing evaluations, or other activities would apply to existing areas and studies, or only to new areas and studies authorized after enactment. We also recommend revising the bill's 15-year authorization of funding for all current heritage areas to provide for ongoing authorization of funding subject to appropriations. 5 bills on the agenda would establish new National Heritage Areas. Each has unique characteristics that have contributed to the rich tapestry of American history and culture. However, so far, only 2 have been found to meet the National Park Service's criteria for establishment of a new National Heritage Area. And those are HR 1286 to designate the Southern Campaign of the Revolution National Heritage Corridor, and HR 1424 to designate the St. Croix National Heritage Area. The department supports these 2 bills with amendments. And while they may have merit, the department recommends Congress consider deferring action on the other 3 bills while the National Park Service works with the sponsoring organizations to ensure their feasibility studies meet the criteria for designation. These are HR 2024 to establish the Southern Maryland National Heritage Area, HR 2107 to establish the nation's oldest port National Heritage Area, and HR 3222 to establish the Alabama Black Belt National Heritage Area. For all 5 bills, the department recommends using conforming language typically used in other National Heritage Area legislation and developing maps for the proposed National Heritage Areas where needed. 6 bills on the agenda would authorize a study to determine if an area meets specified criteria for designation as a National Heritage Area. The areas proposed for study are the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina, Kaena Point and South Kona in Hawaii, Los Caminos del Rio in Texas, the island of Guam, and Bear River in Utah and Idaho. The department supports these bills as we believe that it is vitally important to assess whether the right conditions exist to form and implement a successful national heritage area before Congress acts to designate a proposed national heritage area. We also note that there are 25 previously authorized studies of various types that have not yet been completed and transmitted to Congress. We'd be pleased to work with the bill sponsors and the committee on recommended amendments. Chair Neguse, that concludes my statement, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on these bills.
Thank you, Ms. Beasley. We appreciate your valuable testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witness. And just going through the list here, why don't we go ahead and start with Ranking Member Westerman. All right, if Ranking Member Westerman is not with us, we'll proceed. And let me just remind folks that this is the second panel, questions for Ms. Beasley. Of course, we'll have an opportunity once this is concluded for questions for the third panel, of which I understand there are many different witnesses that folks wish to question. The chair will recognize Mr. Tonko if he has any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Beasley, as you know, we face the deauthorization of some 32 NHAs before the end of 2021. Can you please explain what would happen to the 32 existing national heritage areas whose authorizations are expiring if Congress fails to act?
Certainly, and thank you for your question. So the National Park Service encourages National Heritage Area managers to use their designation, which, as you know, continues in perpetuity, to facilitate sustainable funding from local and private sources. And the National Park Service provides sustainability workshops to National Heritage Area local coordinating entities. And many National Heritage Areas have created their own sustainability plans to guide their organizations. And we're also working with the 30 entities on how to best use their FY21 funding should they sunset.
Thank you. And how would you imagine this would impact their funding and ability to carry out the purposes of their establishment?
Well, obviously, there are a number of important contributions that the National Heritage Areas make. For example, in terms of conservation of land and water, over 20,000 acres of land has been restored and maintained. Over the life of the program, we've issued 33 conservation grants totaling close to $600,000. We've been successful in preserving 247 historic sites, 8,600 acres of cultural landscapes. We've had National Heritage Areas are substantive catalysts for community and economic development through tourism and visitation, grant making, providing support for local projects, generating jobs and tax revenues. So just in 2020 alone, National Heritage Areas leveraged $85.5 million in cash and in-kind support for projects and programs, so greatly increasing the impact of the $20.9 million in federal appropriated funds that we received. We've engaged over 8,000 partners in heritage area activities, and we've benefited from over 23,000 volunteers contributing nearly 400,000 hours for heritage area projects, and that's a $10.1 million value. So the program has had a significant impact on local communities.
Thank you. And one major piece of my National Heritage Area Act is to consolidate the authorization of sites within the system so that heritage areas are no longer having to fight for individual reauthorizations. This would help avoid situations like the one we find ourselves in this year. What is the Park Service's perspective on consolidating the authorization process of heritage areas within the system.
Sorry. So a programmatic approach would help the Park Service address a number of issues, recognizing national heritage areas as a system rather than as individual entities. It would provide uniform national standards for conducting feasibility studies, designation of new areas, approving management plans, conducting evaluations, and it would standardize the authorities and the duties of the Secretary of the Interior, as well as that of the local coordinating entities.
Thank you. And my National Heritage Areas Act would also support the oversight and responsible administration of heritage areas to ensure that they are appropriately stewarding taxpayer dollars. From the National Park Service's perspective, what is the most challenging aspect of managing the Heritage Area Program in a way that ensures local coordinating entities are complying with Park Service recommendations and expectations?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. As with any recipient of federal financial assistance, the organizations are required to report at least semi-annually on how they're using their funding allocation. So the heritage areas are reporting on their financial accounting. They also provide narrative reports on the projects and programs that they've accomplished. So through these reporting mechanisms, which are required by statute and by regulation, the National Park Service is able to verify that these tax dollars are being used appropriately, that cost sharing requirements are being met, and best of all, we're also able to share the success stories for national heritage areas.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize, apologies, we have people coming in and out, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Associate Director Beasley, the authorizing laws for almost all existing national heritage areas contain sunset dates for federal funding ranging from this year to 2034. HR 1316 would extend these sunset dates by authorizing federal funding for all existing NHAs for 15 years. It seems to me that a 15-year funding cycle would likely disincentivize national heritage areas from pursuing any kind of self-sufficiency in the future. Do you think that a single national heritage area could become self-sufficient under this piece of legislation, Ms. Beasley?
Well, thank you for your question, sir. And as I mentioned earlier, the Park Service provides sustainability workshops to heritage area local coordinating entities, and NHAs have, as a result, created their own sustainability plans that guide their organizations. And we always encourage national heritage area managers to use the designation, which does continue in perpetuity.
But Ms. Beasley, if I may, please, I understand that, and that really does sound well, but if you put in legislation that says, yeah, this is all well and good, but for 15 years, you don't have to do it. Realistically, do you think that that is going to work? Do you think there's going to be incentives for them to become self-sufficient if they don't have to?
Sure, and I understand and I appreciate the question. Congress has continually extended these funding authorizations. So it would appear that if it is the Congress's intent to continue the authorization of every heritage area in perpetuity, it might be more efficient to permanently authorize appropriations for NHAs.
Okay.
The federal fund.
That answers that question. So I thank you for that. And I know that puts you in an awkward spot, but that's the truth comes out through that. But different question, Associate Director, each time we create a new national heritage area, more and more money in National Park Service staff time are required to monitor heritage areas and evaluate the performance. This seems to run counter to the original intent of national heritage areas, which were meant to decrease the burden on the National Park Service and the strain on the park system. Do you have any concerns about the rapid increase in national heritage areas?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. As was mentioned in some of the opening statements from the members, national heritage areas can be seen as an alternative to establishing a national park, and they're a locally driven partnership model for heritage conservation. The Park Service always advocates for completion of a feasibility study to determine if the right conditions exist for a successful national heritage area prior to a proposed designation. But ultimately, it's up to Congress to determine if new national heritage areas should be established.
But from your vantage point, do you think we should slow down the creation of these heritage areas? Are you concerned at all about the rapid increase? Because we're really ramping it up here.
Again, sir, it's up to Congress to determine if new national heritage areas should be established.
I think that answers that. I just have one more. Associate Director, the entire state of Tennessee is designated as a national heritage area. Do you believe this was the original intent behind national heritage areas?
Well,
it's a question of original intent. And do you believe that was the original intent?
Well, as I mentioned, the Park Service always encourages that a feasibility is studied, is completed.
This is an entire state, Associate Director. This is an entire state of Tennessee.
Sir, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area study, which was the feasibility study that was undertaken. But the heritage area's boundaries were set by its enabling legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize Ms. Dingle, if she is here. If not, Mr. Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Beasley, first of all, I want to just thank you for the Park Services and the Department's appreciation of national heritage areas. I think anybody that listened to the presentation by my colleagues this morning and the presentation to come from our community partners would appreciate from that presentation the incredibly rich and diverse heritage of our country. And the need to work together to preserve that. So I appreciate the service's willingness to partner from that perspective. And let me stay on Mr. Tonko's bill, because I think it's an important discussion we're having here right now. First of all, I mean, as we look at the big picture of national heritage areas, the service's basic point is they've been operated on an ad hoc basis, and there's been no overall system approach to them, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And from that perspective, of course, we have a national park system, and we have other systems for preservation of unique natural resources throughout our country, national forests, national, other areas, not all administered by the Park Service, of course, but these are systems in the way you describe them. They're an integrated whole. They have uniform rules. They have understandings as to funding. They have understandings as to feasibility studies. They have understandings as to implementation to get away from kind of the ad hoc, discussions about, whether things are appropriate or not, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, are any of those time limited? Are any of those like 5-year authorizations? I mean, as far as I know, the national parks are permanent national parks, right?
That's correct.
And is that true with any of the other areas within the natural resource system? These are not temporary authorizations.
Well, certainly not in the case of national park units, and similarly, designation of national heritage areas are in perpetuity.
I'm sorry. Well, national heritage areas are not in perpetuity, correct?
The authorization is in perpetuity.
Okay, so we are talking about a permanent authorization, but not an authorization from an appropriations perspective, a federal funding perspective.
No, sir. a programmatic solution and legislation that would recognize national heritage areas as a system, as you're describing, would still be subject to appropriations.
Correct, but that's no different from the national park system, right?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, so I mean, the point I'm trying to make here, and it's a legitimate policy question that the ranking member raises, is whether if we provide a system for our national heritage areas, there should be any fundamental difference in treatment as to both authorization and appropriation than the national park system. I mean, I'm just making that observation. Would that be a correct observation?
I believe that would be correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. And I mean, from your perspective, you have advocated for a system as opposed to an ad hoc treatment. Would you, the Park Service, view any reason to distinguish between national heritage areas and the national park system as a system from the perspective of how Congress treats them for, temporary versus permanent federal participation and funding?
Well, as you're aware, national heritage areas are not units of the National Park Service, and as a result, they don't require the same level of federal management responsibilities from an operational standpoint. Establishing them as a system would provide those uniform national standards for how they're managed, how they're measured in terms of their success and so forth. But funding to support national heritage areas, whether as individual entities or as part of a larger recognized system, would still be subject to appropriations and would be subject to the normal appropriations process.
Well, that is correct. But on the other hand, we wouldn't be having questions about whether federal participation lapses after time certain. And I think, my time is winding down, but I'll just observe that I support Mr. Tonko's bill very much because I think it does provide that overall system approach and would answer the policy question as to whether the federal government should in fact be a partner for the long term, as opposed to kind of a transitory partner. I certainly would vote for long term. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Beasley, in your testimony on page 2, it says, we also recommend revising the bill's 15-year authorization of funding for all current heritage areas to provide for an ongoing authorization of funding for NHAs. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that there should be a permanent source of fund, a permanent source of funding for these?
Well, what we mean there, sir, is recognizing national heritage areas as a system rather than solely as individual entities would provide uniform standards for feasibility studies, the designation of new areas, conducting evaluations, approving management plans. It would standardize the authorities and duties of the Secretary of the Interior and that of the local coordinating entities. It's up to Congress to determine federal funding levels for national heritage areas through the appropriations process. In almost every instance, Congress has extended the authorization of appropriations as they approach their sunset dates for funding limits. So if it's the intent of Congress to continue the authorization of every national heritage area in perpetuity, it may be more efficient to permanently authorize appropriations for heritage areas. And
so the recommendation is is make it permanent rather than having to come back every 15 years. Correct? Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. What do you do to protect people from these NHAs encroaching on private property rights? What protections do you put in place? Because there are some stories that I've seen in northern Wisconsin where federal and state lands have put regulations in place that ultimately put restrictions on private property. How do you, first of all, do you protect private property rights and how you go about this?
Sure, and thank you. That's an excellent question. So National Heritage Area designation does not give the federal government any ownership or any control over private property within a national heritage area. And oftentimes the enabling legislation for a heritage area contains provisions that protect private property rights. So, you know, inclusion of private property within an NHA boundary doesn't affect any actions which a private property owner can take under federal law or regulation. There may be state laws or local ordinances that affect national heritage areas, but those are independent of federal law.
Do you coordinate with local units of government?
Yes, sir. As part of the feasibility study process, we do consult with the local community and with the local government.
Do you coordinate with them, which is a legal term in federal law? In other words, giving them an equal seat at the table to be able to do that give and take, to have a say in what this is going to look like, to make sure that it protects the local government's interests.
Again, NHA designation doesn't give the federal government any ownership or any control over non-federal property.
Okay, thank you for that. I would just close by saying this. If you go back and look at Congressman Bruce Vento's words from 1994, Democratic congressman from Minnesota, and I'm not asking you to comment on this, Ms. Beasley. This is general comments to the committee. He said about this program, in 10 years, we're out of here. And that was the intent back then by both Republicans and Democrats, as put in words by former Congressman Vento from the Twin Cities. And I think we need to get back to that with this committee, because our country is buried in debt. It is buried in debt, and authorizing more money, large and small, and you can put this under the heading of small, but it's everything that is going into this spending orgy that's going on out here in Washington, D.C., that is going to bury this country in debt. And I would say, if we're authorizing dollars for the National Park Service, I hear from the National Park Service regularly, we have significant needs. Why are we buying more land? Why are we trying to take control of more land when you can't take care of your own? I liken it to the person whose roof is falling in on their house, and they see their neighbor's lot come for sale, and they say, gosh, we got to go buy that, rather than fixing up their own lot. That's the federal government right now. They're buying that lot right next door while their roof is caving in. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Lamborn, if he's here. And if not, the chair will recognize Mr. Heiss, if he is here. Seeing as how he is not, the chair will recognize Mr. Rosendale. All right, and the chair will recognize Mr. Obernolte, who I see on the screen here. So
Thank you very much,
a
Mr.
lucky
Chairman.
winner.
And thank you, Ms. Beasley, for the testimony. I had a question. I'd like to follow up on Congressman Fulcher's line of questioning. How often does, I mean, obviously the purposes of the National Heritage Areas is to provide some federal seed money to enable these areas to become over time self-sufficient. How often does that actually occur with the NHAs that we have started in the last couple of decades?
Well, generally, it's been the practice of the Congress to extend authorization of appropriations for heritage areas as they get close to the sunset dates for their funding limits.
Okay, so do we have any data that shows how often these NHAs actually actually become self-sufficient? And because that is the given purpose of the program, right?
Yes, sir. I appreciate that question. I don't think I have specific details that would be responsive to the question, but we'll get that information to your office as soon as possible.
All right, thank you. So you have been talking with Congressman Fulcher about the necessity of doing feasibility studies prior to authorizing these NHAs, just to make sure that it's an appropriate action to take, which is something I also agree with you on. Does the feasibility study include an analysis of the likelihood that an NHA will become self-sufficient over time?
So feasibility studies, they're very important to assess whether conditions exist to form and implement a successful national heritage area, right? So a feasibility study gathers information about the area itself and whether it contains an assemblage of natural, historic, and cultural resources that represent a diverse aspect of American history that's worthy of conservation and continuing use. And those feasibility studies also do look at whether such an area would be best managed through a public-private partnership.
Okay, but are we taking a look as we do these feasibility studies? Are we doing a financial analysis of the likelihood that the NHA will become self-sufficient over time?
So we have feasibility study guidelines that provide a suggested methodology and how to apply the National Historic Area criteria and sort of a standard sort of format for feasibility studies that do have substantive public involvement. I don't think I have the specific details of how financial sustainability is examined through the feasibility study process, but we can find that out and get the information back to you after the hearing.
All right, well, thank you. Let me just respectfully suggest that if our express goal with NHAs is to have them become financially self-sufficient as opposed to national parks, then I think it would behoove us to have that be a criteria of the analysis, the feasibility study, because if it's not feasible for them to become self-sufficient, then they ought to be national parks and not heritage areas. So anyway, that's just my opinion, but thank you very much for the testimony. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gomer. Give Mr. Gomer one more minute. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kular. And the chair recognizes Mr. Kahili. All right, it appears that none of our colleagues have questions on this front, so I want to thank Ms. Beasley again for her important testimony. Thank you for appearing today. And I want to thank each of the members for their questions. We will now transition to our third panel. As with the first two panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. Before introducing our witnesses, I'll remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. The witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tonko for 30 seconds to introduce Ms. Sarah Capon, chairwoman of the Alliance of National Heritage Areas and executive director of the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is indeed my pleasure and honor to introduce Sarah Capon, the Executive Director of New York's Niagara Falls National Heritage Area. What an informed voice she is for heritage areas. For a decade, she has led efforts to preserve the natural, cultural, and historic resources of Niagara Falls. She has expertly strengthened community partnerships, developed management plans, and created cultural tourism and educational outreach programs to ensure that, with needed congressional support, one of our nation's jewels can be protected and shared with visitors for generations to come. Sarah also serves as chair of the Alliance of National Heritage Areas, where her advocacy efforts have highlighted the importance of national heritage area work for preserving our nation's cultural resources while revitalizing the often vulnerable communities and economies alongside them. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah, and an honor to introduce you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Mr. Tonko. We're so pleased to have you as one of our champions. Good afternoon to all the distinguished members of the committee. As Mr. Tonko introduced myself, I don't see a need to do any further. Your past and continued support of the National Heritage Area Program is greatly appreciated. I just want to note that the hearing represents so many incredible chapters of history that all Americans should know. Each testimony that's been given feels like a home to a national heritage area. I also feel strongly that they represent bipartisan common ground where one can instantly feel a pride of place in the stories that were represented here today. Despite the outstanding efforts of this committee, its staff, our champions, national heritage areas are still facing a looming sunset crisis in less than 120 days. As you know, under our current legislative model, national heritage areas are subject to individual sunset clauses, after which they lose federal funding. For too long now, the lack of a long-term legislative solution has led to a challenging 2-year cycle of reauthorization that expends the energy of this committee, members of Congress, the National Park Service, National Heritage Area boards, and staff. Most importantly, this never-ending cycle takes away from the important work we do in our communities across the country. As NHAs and their supporters in Congress spend valuable time and energy on reauthorization bills, there are currently 16 individual reauthorization bills in the House and another 12 individual bills in the Senate, all awaiting committee action. The National Heritage Area Act of 2021 solves this problem and is vitally important to the stability of the 55 national heritage areas that exist within the program and the future ones that are to come. 2020 brought our nation unprecedented challenges. As we collectively struggled to find solutions, national heritage areas responded to the crisis with authentic, innovative programs that grounded us in our landscapes and our communities. Amid the uncertainty and turmoil, national heritage areas provided respite. Now, as the nation is moving into recovery, national heritage areas are again at the forefront. The trails, museums, visitor centers, and programs we run are ready for residents and visitors to experience and to generate economic impact desperately needed in local communities. Unfortunately, our focus is diverted by the impending sunsets of 30 national heritage areas. Our communities are already fragile from the pandemic, having experienced the loss of local revenue, favorite restaurants, and local businesses. Losing national heritage areas would just add further pain to what our communities are experiencing. HR 1316 establishes a system of national heritage areas as an integral part of the National Park Service, ensuring uniform standards for the way NHAs are designated, managed, and assessed, and providing Congress with an enhanced ability to conduct oversight of the program. In addition, it ensures the long-term partnerships which NHAs have worked so hard to forge, and reaffirms our commitment to the protection of private property rights. Representing considerably less than 1% of the total National Park Service budget, the National Heritage Area Program is one of the Department of Interior's most cost-effective initiatives. relying on a public-private partnership in which every federal dollar is matched with an average of $5.50 in other public and private funding. As you know, we're designated by Congress and managed by the Park Service, and we tell nationally important stories. So many that even the ones I heard today, make my heart beat stronger because there's such beautiful stories from all the members that testified earlier today. But those stories shape the tapestry of who we are as Americans. And as chairwoman of the Alliance of National Heritage Areas, I'd like to emphasize that those stories are important to better understand who we are as people, and that the National Heritage Areas model the type of efficiency we need to see in federal programs. Over the course of the last 3 years, the ANHA has pursued every legislative pathway in regular order to ensure that NHAs do not sunset, and that the successful federal program is stable and uniform for existing NHAs and new ones, allowing us to commemorate and protect the diverse history and unique resources that Congress has directed us to do. Again, we are grateful for your continued support and commitment while we work together to overcome this difficult challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Alexa Sutton Lawrence, founder of the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collective.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm Dr. Alexandra Sutton Lawrence, Alexa for short, and I'm speaking to you today on behalf of the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative. The collaborative is a community collective that comprises representatives of more than 35 local and national organizations and communities. Among them, the Nansemond Indian Nation, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Hampton Roads Chapter, City of Suffolk's Parks and Recreation, Isaac Walton League's local chapter, Preservation Virginia, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The mission of the collaborative is to strengthen the relationship between cultural, tribal, environmental, and governmental organizations in order to advance activities that protect and respect the swamp. I'm speaking to you today in support of this proposed feasibility study to possibly create a Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Area. As you know, national heritage areas are grassroots, community-driven, public-private partnerships designated by Congress for the protection and preservation of resources and stories that are both regionally unique and nationally important. Nothing fits this description better than the Great Dismal Swamp, with its culturally and ecologically significant landscape, its vibrant modern-day communities, and its irreplaceable history. Among the diverse members of the collaborative, we all agree that the Great Dismal Swamp is one of the most unique and valuable historical, cultural, and ecological landscapes in the United States. Sitting along the border of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, this magnificent place contains some of the last remains of a vast swampy forest, which once spanned more than 1 million acres. Now reduced to a tenth of its original size, it still works generously to provide space for education, recreation, and enjoyment, as well as health benefits such as clean air, clean water, fire protection, hunting and fishing opportunities, and rich soil for agriculture to the more than 1 million people in the Hampton Roads region. Designated a National Wildlife Refuge in 1974, the core of the Great Dismal Swamp contains incredible unbroken stretches of cypress and cedar forest that has sensitive wildlife populations, including at least 47 different species of mammals like black bears and bobcats. Over 200 species of birds spend at least part of their annual migratory cycle in the swamp, and nearly 100 species breed on the refuge. But the natural bounty of the Great Dismal Swamp isn't its only value. The swamp has been the backdrop to some of the most profound moments in United States early history, and has hosted some of our most fascinating and outstanding citizen heroes, many of whose lives are recorded in exceptional narratives, autobiographies, and histories, including George Washington, Harriet Jacobs, Moses Grandy, Elizabeth Bass, and Mary Smith Peake. The swamp is also home to an incredibly rich number of cultural and historical sites, including the ancestral lands, buried artifacts, and ancestors of the Nansemond Indian Nation, the largest known collection of archaeological artifacts from mid-Atlantic Maroon colonies, generational communities of people who escaped a slaving society by living hidden in the swamp, one of the only known water-based stops on the Underground Railroad network to freedom, the Dismal Swamp Canal, the oldest still operating canal in the United States, one of a young George Washington's first investments in the country. Dug by hand by enslaved African and African American laborers, These efforts connected the Chesapeake Bay to the Albemarle Sound, and in doing so laid the foundation for the United States' economic prosperity up and down the East Coast. And last but not least, it's home to an incomparable collection of early colonial artifacts, towns, and churches, built by free people of color, whose families navigated an increasingly precarious position in society by retreating toward the swamp. In total, the swamp has innumerable stories to tell about the power and resilience of our most virtuous and most widely shared American values: love of family, commitment to community, drive for freedom, desire for education, and fearlessness in the face of oppression. Bringing these stories together in a unified heritage area would allow us to direct attention and resources to those places, these heroes, and to these core American values. In 2013, a report on the economic impact of national heritage areas estimated that the economic benefit of all 49 NHA sites on the nation's economy was about $12.9 billion annually. That included 148,000 jobs, $1.2 billion in federal taxes. Just looking at the Northeast region alone, those 21 NHAs had an annual economic impact of $5.4 billion, supporting more than 66,880 jobs and generating $602 million in local and state taxes. We are thrilled to explore what the Great Dismal Swamp NHA designation could mean for us, for our communities, for the Great Dismal Swamp, and for the states of Virginia and North Carolina. The swamp is a place that holds, in the liminal folds of its misty innards, curious relics, innovations of economy, feats of engineering, tragedies of human horror, victories of liberation, and stories of the passionate love for family, freedom, and happiness that remind us again and again that some of the greatest American heroes are unsung and unknown, that their achievements have laid the foundation for all our current prosperity, and that their sacrifices have given all of us our current freedoms and powers. The least that we can do is thank them by protecting this irreplaceable piece of the United States. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair will now recognize, let's see here, I believe Whip Clyburn is with us for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Douglas Bostick, Executive Director of the South Carolina Battlefield Preservation Trust.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Douglas W. Bostick, a native of James Island, South Carolina, who serves as Executive Director and CEO of the South Carolina Battlefield Preservation Trust, a land trust that protects and preserves historic military sites. Mr. Bostick also serves as Director of the South Carolina Liberty Trust, a statewide initiative to preserve Revolutionary War battlefields in South Carolina. He has negotiated and supervised the preservation of 14 Revolutionary War battlefields in South Carolina and is the author of 26 books, all non-fiction history. His knowledge of history is enhanced by a gift for storytelling. Thank you for being here with us today, Mr. Bostick, and I'm pleased to present you to this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Clyburn. First, allow me to offer my thanks for your kind invitation to testify before the subcommittee for this legislative hearing. I'd also like to thank Congressman Clyburn for his leadership in sponsoring H.R. 1286. As a professional historian, I'll have to say I've been fascinated sitting here since 1 o'clock listening to all these many proposals and the great stories that make our country. In the Southern Campaign, we can find stories and people to which all Americans today can relate. The Southern Campaign is the story of all Carolinians, white and black, men and women, new immigrants, and Native Americans who fought to earn liberty. It's also the story of Europeans like Casimir Pulaski and the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to America drawn by the concepts of liberty and personal rights. South Carolinian General William Moultrie recorded in his memoirs his thoughts at the beginning of the war, and he wrote, "A rich and powerful nation with numerous fleets and experienced admirals sailing triumphant over the ocean with large armies and able generals in many parts of the globe. This great nation we dared to oppose. We opposed them without money, without arms, without ammunition. We had no generals, no armies, no admirals, and no fleets. This was our situation when the contest began. The Southern Campaign tells an integral story of the founding of our great country. When the Marquis de Lafayette determined that he wanted to go to America to offer his services, the Continental Congress did not have funding to bring him to the country, and instead he bought his own sailing ship to make the 2-month journey. He landed at Georgetown, South Carolina. During the voyage, he wrote a love letter to his wife, who was back in France. And part of the love letter says this, which are words that I think all Americans today should hear again and again. Lafayette wrote, "The happiness of America is ultimately connected to the happiness of all mankind. She will become the safe and respected asylum of virtue, integrity, toleration, equality, and tranquil happiness." Now, I would suggest to you, we're still struggling to live up to the words of the Marquis de Lafayette and how he saw this great country at the time of its formation. But we've made remarkable achievements, and we have many ways to go. And understanding the story of the origin of our country, I think, is integral to us as a society and a community of diverse people to move forward. The Southern Campaign offers great stories of African Americans, both free and enslaved, that fought for liberty, stories of women that sacrificed as combatants, spies, and working with the Army. It tells the stories of many men who sacrificed, some giving the ultimate sacrifice to organize and provide for our liberty. I appreciate the consideration of the committee in this bill, and once again appreciate the support of Congressman Clyburn and all of the South Carolina delegation in endorsing this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony, and we certainly appreciate you being here today. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case for 30 seconds to introduce Ms. Suzanne Case, Chair of the Department of Land and Natural Resources for the state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Chair. I am indeed very happy to introduce Suzanne Case, who has served some 6 years now as Chair of the Hawaii State Department of Land and Natural Resources. DLNR is our state agency responsible for managing our state lands, some 1/4 of all Hawaii lands under direct stewardship and more indirectly, and all of our fresh and ocean waters. DLNR's responsibilities also include the preservation of our rich history and culture and the protection of our unique flora and fauna. Chair Case served previously 28 years with the Nature Conservancy, the last 14 as Executive Director of our Hawaii program. I have personally been privileged to know Chair Case all of her life, as she is my sister, and I welcome her to our committee.
Ms. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the subcommittee, honorable representatives, aloha. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of HR 1908 for a new Kaena Point National Heritage Area on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. My name is Suzanne Case, and I'm the Director of the Hawaii State Department of Land and Natural Resources. I want to acknowledge and thank Congressman Ed Case, and Congressman Kai Pehele for their leadership in introducing both this legislation and the South Kona National Heritage Area Bill for the equally precious coast from Kalai, South Point to Honolulu Bay on the island of Hawaii. There are 55 national heritage areas across our nation, but none in Hawaii. Hawaii offers an opportunity to expand the National Heritage Area system into the tropical Pacific. Kaena Point in Hawaiian, the heat, lies on the western tip of Oahu, by far our most popular island, facing the setting sun. Kaena is a coast of black lava and rare intact sand dune ecosystem, designated a state natural area reserve and state park. Let me give you a feel for this rich heritage. By ancient Hawaiian custom, when a person dies, his or her soul travels down the mountain ridge to the westernmost tip of the island, to the Lena Akauhane, the leaping place of the soul, and is thrust off into Po, darkness. Kaena Point hosts a famous Lena, a large limestone outcropping facing the sea. These are places rich in legends of the sea cave of Nanaue, the shark man, of Mokaena Heiau Temple, high above the cliff, watching for war canoes from the west. Low-crawling endemic Hawaiian plants hold the sand above the high wash of the waves. Naupaka, Pauohi'iaka, and the Ilima, flower of royalty. Fishers, hikers, swimmers, divers, and paddlers immerse themselves at Ka'aikai, the water's edge. Native endangered Hawaiian monk seals, Ilio holoikauaua, dog that glides through the rolling waves, haul out to rest or nurse pups. Humpback whales and Pacific bottlenose dolphins swim by offshore. Now protected from predators, dogs, cats, rats, mongoose, ants, off-road vehicles, the nesting birds, long gone, have returned. Now hundreds of the grand Laysan albatross and thousands of wedge-tailed shearwaters, red-footed and brown boobies, and brown noddies. Tracks of the old sugarcane haul train remind us of Hawaii's historic pineapple and sugar plantations and our diverse immigrant worker heritage. South Kona is similarly rich in heritage with a state natural area reserve and wilderness area, preserving a stone path, ancient coastal highway, a holua slide, fishing shrines and burial caves, as well as state endangered turtles and monk seals, and dolphin resting bays and beautiful reefs. We work with many community groups who have been protecting and stewarding these areas for many years. These good people, Hawaiian descendants of the area, Kama'aina people of the land, and newcomers, pull weeds, pick up marine debris, monitor nests, report illegal activity, tend cultural sites, and guard ancient burials, and proudly practice cultural traditions. They should be included in community outreach in the National Heritage Area studies. This is our precious heritage that we inherit from those who came before. We preserve and enjoy now and pass down to those who come next. We look forward to working with the federal government together with local communities in these studies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your testimony. We appreciate you being here. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kahele for 30 seconds to introduce Ms. Wendy LaRose, President and CEO of the Kona Kohala Chamber of Commerce.
Mahalo, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. It's my honor to introduce Wendy LaRose, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Kona Kohala Chamber of Commerce. Chair, this is a nonprofit member organization that exists to provide leadership and advocacy for a successful business environment on the west side, the Kona side of the island of Hawaii. And this is exactly where, and in this region, where the proposed South Kona National Heritage Area exists. Prior to joining the Chamber and the staff in 2016, Wendy was an active volunteer in the organization and chaired the Education and Workforce Development Committee. So it's my honor to introduce Wendy LaRose, the President and CEO of the Kona Kohala Chamber of Commerce. Mahalo, and I yield back.
Aloha, Chair Nagus, Ranking Member Fulcher, and the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Land. and honorable representatives. As mentioned, my name is Wendy Laros, and I'm the president and CEO of the Conecuhala Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of our chamber, I respectfully request that you support the South Kona National Heritage Area Act of 2021, House Resolution 1925, introduced by Representative Kai Ali'i Kahele and co-sponsored by Representative Ed Case. With nearly 500 members, our chamber exists to provide leadership and advocacy for West Hawaii. Since our founding in 1968, we've worked to enhance the quality of life for our community through a strong, sustainable economy. We believe South Kona is a very special place filled with unique cultural, historical, and natural resources that deserve this special designation. We understand that House Resolution 1925 outlines the first step in a multi-year process and calls for a study to assess the suitability and feasibility of designating the site as a national heritage area. We know that heritage areas are community-based efforts that contain a mixture of public and private property, historic sites, trails, and commercial districts. We realize these are different from national parks. For example, land and property ownership in these areas are retained by the owners. The National Park Service does, however, work in partnership with heritage areas, and I would like to point out that Hawaii Island has a long history and strong connection to the National Park Service. This includes 3 national parks here on Hawaii Island, and as a resident of Kona for over 30 years, I've experienced what I'm about to describe to you. The first is the famous Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, established over 100 years ago in 1916. This awe-inspiring park includes 2 active volcanoes, one that recently erupted in 2018. Park visitors can hike through a rainforest into a volcanic crater, venture into a 500-year-old lava tube, or view one of the most extensive petroglyph fields in all of Hawaii. According to the State of Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, this park had over 1.3 million visitors in 2019. The second park is Pu'uhonua Ohonaunau National Historic Park, established in 1961 and also located on the Kona coast. The park is home to some of the most significant traditional sites in the Hawaiian archipelago. The most prominent feature is the Pu'uhonua, or the place of refuge, which is enclosed by a 965-foot long lava rock wall. There's also Haleo Keaweheau, a sacred temple that housed the bones of ali'i, or high chiefs, of ancient Hawaii. This park receives over 400,000 visitors annually. The third park, Kolokohonokahau National Historical Park, my personal favorite. It was established in 1978. It reveals the spirit and ingenuity of the Hawaiian people who thrived in an ancient settlement on the rugged lava rock coastline in North Kona. Prominent features include 2 very large fish ponds, petroglyphs, house site platforms, and religious sites, and green sea turtles often bask on the beach. This park receives over 200,000 visitors annually. The tourism industry drives our local economy in Kona. In 2019, over 1.7 million visitors arrived on Hawaii Island, and most of them here on the west side. With visitor arrivals returning to pre-pandemic levels, community-driven destination management is a common theme in Hawaii. Ultimately, the South Kona National Heritage Area designation would assist the community in joining together to preserve, promote, and manage this distinctive site filled with cultural significance and scenic beauty. This area reflects a valuable part of Hawaii's history and the story of the United States. Please support House Resolution 1925. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony and for joining us today. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lucille Walker, Executive Director of the Southern Maryland Heritage Area at Destination Southern Maryland.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher and distinguished members of this subcommittee. My name is Lucille Walker, and I am the Executive Director of the Southern Maryland Heritage Area, a state-based heritage area of significant national importance. And I thank you for this opportunity to submit testimony on behalf of HR 2024, the Southern Maryland National Heritage Area Act. Please let me first thank Representative Hoyer, and Senators Cardin and Van Hollen for their extraordinary leadership towards this designation and their efforts on behalf of Southern Maryland as a whole. As a spokesperson for this important initiative, I represent a unique coalition of partnerships: federal, state, municipal, community-based, bipartisan, private, public, educational, environmental, inclusive. HR 2024 will establish an historically rich and culturally diverse national heritage area to include Calvert, Charles, St. Mary's, and Southern Prince George's counties. Recognized as essential to the heritage of Maryland, the current state-based heritage area has had a notable impact. The economic contribution report is included with this testimony. So, given that we are a successful state heritage area, why is it crucial to become a national heritage area? Because this region is one of the foundation stories of our nation. To begin with, it is in Southern Maryland that religious freedom was codified into law for the first time in the entire Western world. The first time ever that any type of religious toleration, this founding principle, this basic human right, was put into law. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, also known as the Act Concerning Religion, provided the foundation for religious freedom within the United States Constitution. The proposed area is a land of many firsts and contrasts. Here are just a few. It is where Maryland was founded in 1634, and the original fort was recently discovered. An interpretation will be done in conjunction with the region's native people, the Piscataway-Conoy tribe, to more fully understand this contact between worlds. It is also here that the first person of African descent ever served in a legislature in America, Matthias de Sousa, 1642. The first time a woman ever petitioned for the right to vote, Margaret Brent, 1648. These are remarkable firsts and need to be further explored within the national context. There are no histories in isolation. Southern Maryland has a rich tapestry of agricultural and maritime heritage that continue to this day, with 1,000 miles of shoreline and tobacco barns from the 1700s onward. This area also includes the newly designated Mallows Bay Potomac River National Marine Sanctuary. It also includes a UNESCO slave site of remembrance. We are where the first astronauts trained, and we are the ancestral home of the Piscataway tribe. In brief, the story of Southern Maryland is the national story. An extensive resource inventory is included with this testimony. A steering committee was formed in 2019, and consultants were engaged to guide the National Heritage Area feasibility study process. This study is now in the steering committee review before submission to the National Park Service for technical review. This designation will elevate the profile of Southern Maryland on the national level. Specifically, important sites with valuable national stories, which are currently not included in any federal or state heritage area, will be woven into this narrative. The timing of this legislation is also very important. The state of Maryland was founded in Southern Maryland, and the 400th commemoration is only 13 years away. National Heritage Area designation will present a compelling avenue for building momentum and interest in this commemoration, with subsequent economic benefits to this rural region. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, this designation will provide our national dialogue with an essential part of our nation's story, often unknown and overlooked, but pivotal to the understanding of who we are, who we were, and who we want to be as a nation. Thank you for your time and your consideration.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes, Mr. Rutherford, are you here? I don't believe so. I believe he may have had to step out, but okay, I don't think he's here. So the chair will now recognize Ms. Kathy Fleming, Executive Director of the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the House Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, for allowing me the opportunity to provide this testimony. Thank you as well to the many members of the Florida Congressional Delegation for your support of our proposed National Heritage Area, and special thanks to Congressman John Rutherford, Al Lawson, and Michael Waltz. I am Kathy Fleming, and I'm the Executive Director of St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum in St. Augustine, Florida. I am also the founder of the nation's oldest port Heritage Area Alliance. And on behalf of the Alliance, we thank the committee for your consideration of House Bill 2107, which establishes the nation's oldest port National Heritage Area in the state of Florida. Community members, municipal servants, historians, archaeologists, and nonprofit organizations have worked together as a team to document how the rich maritime landscape, converging waterways, and the Atlantic Ocean shaped a unique cultural landscape in Northeast Florida's Nassau, Duval, St. Johns, and Flagler counties. A nation's oldest port National Heritage Area recognizes this landscape as a special place in America. The Heritage Area Alliance is dedicated to connecting residents and our many visitors with the historical, cultural, natural, recreational, and scenic aspects of the region through education and preservation and promotion of the area's distinctive stories and resources and traditions. To achieve this goal, our community has worked together to prepare a feasibility study. And in fact, we have coordinated with the National Park Service back in 2013 and included a sample of the approved study for your review with my testimony. We also have a map and some other things. The feasibility study is an introduction to a unique coastal landscape. From the Native Americans called Timucua, who lived here first, to the diverse people who call the area home today, this region has been shaped by the sea. Here is where Ponce de Leon's navigator took his northernmost, I'll say, astrolabe reading before he landed in 1513 to name La Florida. The same landscape attracted Frenchman Jean Ribault to establish Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville, Florida in 1562. And under the command of Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the Spanish founded St. Augustine in 1565, the nation's oldest continually occupied European city. About 60 miles from the ancient city's shallow but historical port of call, the powerful Gulf Stream makes its final turn east, flowing from the Caribbean trade routes back toward Europe and significantly Spain, the world's foremost maritime power in the 16th century. This unique multicultural geographical region has influenced the growth of our nation from its normative maritime environment and foodways to its tourism-based economy today. We have many stories to tell, but one that I want to highlight is that of Fort Mose, located about 2 miles north of St. Augustine and within our boundaries. In 1738, Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, known as Fort Mose, was established as the first legally sanctioned community of freed slaves in what is now known as the United States. Fort Mose served as a northern defensive line for the Spanish city. Importantly, its free African residents were escaped slaves from the British colonies to the north. They sought sanctuary and freedom granted by the Spanish crown. That Fort Mose sits on a waterway is no accident, and this is just one of the many extraordinary stories of our diverse region. A nation's oldest port National Heritage Area affords national and international recognition of our maritime legacy and multicultural history. And we've received hundreds of letters of resolutions and municipal resolutions of support from a wide range of stakeholders. Hundreds of shipwrecks that litter the regional waterways bear witness to the remarkable stories, from abandoned Native American canoes to excavations of wrecked ships carrying British loyalists who were fleeing the victorious Americans as they evacuated Charleston, South Carolina in 1782. We respectfully ask that you support the nation's oldest port National Heritage Area. And we thank you again for your time and consideration. We are committed to utilizing any support that we receive from the National Park Service program wisely, with the goal of economic self-sufficiency. And I look forward to your comments and questions. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Christopher Rincon, Executive Director of the River Pierce Foundation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George C. Rincon, also known as Christopher Rincon. I'm the director of the River Pierce Foundation, and I have lived in San Ignacio, Texas since 1995. We create educational curricula for K through 5 students using the historic buildings of Zapata County to teach multidisciplinary lessons about sustainable community development, ecology, and natural resource conservation. I'm here today to speak in support of Congressman Cuellar's legislation, H.R. 2359, which raises the Los Caminos del Rio Heritage Corridor a step closer to the national significance it deserves. San Ignacio is a remarkable place along this heritage corridor in that its rural character has remained comparatively intact for much of its existence, and it has been helpful to use its ecology as a constant in nature. In 2005, I remember reading an essay by American author Mike Davis discussing how global population growth would threaten to change rural communities into extended suburban areas as large cities would become megalopolises. I had to look up the pronunciation of that word, and I learned that one prominent example is known as Boss Wash, the chain of contiguous cities and regions which extends from Boston to Washington, D.C. And thus I realized how far removed we are from this reality down here in Zapata County. Although there has been major growth all along the U.S.-Mexico border, Zapata has seen relatively little. It may be the climate or the location, but for centuries, this geographical feature has been a boon for the preservation and study of the vernacular architecture of our region. Today, San Ignacio is distinguished as the last collection of vernacular architecture from the 19th century settlement of the lower Rio Grande River in the United States. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, and subsequently its oldest building, the Trevino Uribe Rancho, became a National Historic Landmark in 1997. I came to visit this small hamlet when I began studying the work of American visual artist Michael Tracy. Mr. Tracy has lived here since 1978, shortly after the National Register nomination was approved, and together we have seen what historic preservation has done for the cultural heritage of our nation. Tracy, having lived both in Austin and Galveston, Texas, had already been involved with the process of community revitalization in historic neighborhoods, and it was his example which inspired my work in historic preservation. When I finally settled here in San Ignacio, the state of Texas was 5 years into a pilot heritage tourism program, which was known locally as Los Caminos del Rio. Under the guidance of Mario Sanchez, PhD, a fantastic book called A Shared Experience was published documenting the binational architectural heritage of the lower Rio Grande Valley from Laredo to Brownsville, along with their Mexican counterparts. Every little town along the Rio Grande has had its own nucleus of historic structures, along with the stories to bring them to life. The Rio Grande has only been a border for a relatively short period of time, and the rich past which has shaped our communities to this day must never be lost. If neglected for another 300 years, I can guarantee that a place like San Ignacio will continue in its evolution with a strong inclination to remain unchanged. But any protections and acknowledgments we can put in place today will enhance the future, its education, its economic development, its art and poetry, its architecture. Sometimes the architecture may be the only surviving artifact. There was also a cautionary tale embedded in my experience. To move too quickly on a project like this inhibits organic growth, and this is always the most sustainable. Eventually, the Los Caminos mission outgrew its support organization, and while it's sad to appear to watch such a noble effort appear to wane, the energy invested by early donors and volunteers laid the groundwork for heritage tourism. All the communities along this heritage corridor went on to lead their own efforts into preservation. Let us never lose sight of the sacrifices and struggles that got us to this vantage point. That too is history and part of the sustainable growth. As an advocate of the preservation of this heritage, I would recommend that we need this legislation to pass. I would like to thank Congressman Cuellar for his leadership and also the committee for allowing me to testify today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony, and we appreciate you being here. The chair now recognizes Ms. Emily Jones, Southeast Regional Director for the National Parks Conservation Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of H.R. 3222 to establish the Alabama Black Belt National Heritage Area. National Parks Conservation Association strongly supports the passage of this bill. And we want to thank Representative Sewell and the Alabama delegation, along with Representative Tonga and Kildee, for introduction of the bill, and of course, Senator Shelby and Tuberville for introducing Senate Bill 1643. We are very pleased to have bipartisan support for this legislation. Alabama Black Belt is nationally significant for its central role in the struggle for equality epitomized in the American Civil Rights Movement. While encompassing just 1,000 miles in Alabama, the events that happened there shaped our entire nation. I see my head's cut off. Black Belt is a colloquial term referencing the slash of dark, fertile soil across Alabama's midsection that produced cotton in great abundance. That cash crop was harvested by thousands of enslaved African Americans whose labor brought incredible wealth to the white planter class in this region of Alabama. The heritage area, the Alabama Black Belt Heritage Area, is comprised of 19 south central Alabama counties. Over 300 sites have been identified within these counties that illustrate the architecture, folkways, arts, archaeological and natural resources and history of the region. And we say that in Alabama, in the Black Belt, the stories are as rich as the land. Those stories continue to unfold. I should also note that we've been working with the Department of Interior on this Black Belt designation for over 10 years and have submitted some recent addendums that I hope that will be helpful to Mrs. Beasley, Ms. Beasley. I also wanted to let you know about a letter of support. We submitted also several letters of support, some mapping, but in one of the letters of support, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey said that Alabama has made a significant investment in telling its story. The establishment of the Black Belt National Heritage Area will bring even wider attention to the rich history and culture of the area in a way that complements the recent establishment of civil rights sites championed by the state. We regard this as a critical next step in the process of recognition and reconciliation for our people and the preservation and interpretation of our history, all of which in the Black Belt is long overdue. Just a little background, prior to DeSoto's arrival in 1540, indigenous people lived on this land. What were Native American pathways soon became known as the Old Federal Road. The settlers discovered incredible expanses of prairie and river cane that became nearly extinct as the production of cotton created the nation's wealthiest economy in 1800. In 1814, Andrew Jackson led an expedition against the Creek, defeating them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. That forced them into a treaty where they surrendered 20 million acres of their traditional land. About half of that is present-day Alabama, and 1/5 of that is now Georgia. The Indian Removal Act opened up the tribal land to farmers and planters from the Carolinas, Virginia, and Tennessee. And with them came the expansion of slavery as enslaved Africans and African Americans were brought in by boat up from Mobile and up that extensive river system or over land from the plantations to the north and east. Montgomery, Alabama became one of the largest slave markets in the South. It's no accident that former capital of the Confederacy was where Dr. King chose to make a stand for voting rights in 1965. The civil rights movement grew from this geographically and culturally distinct region of Alabama. Small communities in the Black Belt, such as Tuskegee, Marion, Selma, and Haynesville, transformed into scenes of some of the most critical moments in the African American struggle for equality in the 1950s and 60s. The movement's origins are deeply rooted in human history and the national landscape of the Black Belt. While the landmark events of the American Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, and the Selma to Montgomery marches are all remarkable and nationally significant in and of themselves. They are so much more richly textured and nuanced when they're explored in the context of the people who were there in that place and the cultural traditions from which they arose. Understanding those origins, the process, and outcomes of this struggle for equality is central to our national identity and the ongoing effort in our nation to secure freedom from oppression for all our citizens. The Black Belt of 2021 tells the collective and individual story of the hope of Reconstruction and the terror of Jim Crow. It tells the story of the African American diaspora, which continues to fight for the resources and opportunities it deserves, of strong educators and community leaders who are committed to success despite incredible obstacles imposed by poverty and lack of basic resources. Since 2003, community leaders, local governments, grassroots groups have all been coming together to work on this collaborative effort to document their cultural and natural and historic inventories that tell this story of this region. HR 3222 will provide Black Belt citizens with the resources and structure to more capably protect and interpret their unique story and culture, provide residents and visitors with a better understanding of their truly significant history and the biological diversity of the area. The Alabama Black Belt National Heritage Area is long overdue. The economic investment in the future of the region, rich in history and fortified by the remarkable strength and creativity of its citizens. Multiple supporters. There are probably, I don't know how many groups, 40 or 50 groups that are involved in this, but just to name a few: the African American Civil Rights Sites Consortium, Alabama Audubon, the Alabama Black Belt Adventures, Alabama Historical Commission, the Elmore Bowling Initiative, and Conservation Alabama are just a few. We thank you for your time in receiving this testimony. We certainly appreciate your support and would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'd also just like to note that National Park Conservation Association strongly supports Representative Clyburn's legislation, HR 1286, and looks forward to working with him as we move toward that story and toward the sesquicentennial of the American Revolution. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Brian Carver, Director of Community and Economic Development for the Bear River Association of Governments.
Thank you, Chairman. I am honored to introduce Mr. Carver. He has served many years in this capacity in multiple roles with the Bear River Association of Governments, and I'm honored that the bill that our team is pushing with the Bear River Heritage is been collaborative with his organization. Brian knows firsthand what cultural, historical, and geological attributes make this area of northern Utah and South Idaho so special. He's also uniquely qualified to provide insight into the strong local support, which I think is one of the most fundamental key pieces of this piece of legislation, is our local support that exists for the Bear River Heritage Area Study Act. We're fortunate to have him with us today. I'm grateful for all that he and his colleagues have done to promote this important effort over the years, and we're thrilled as a team to be a part of it. So thank you. And again, Mr. Carver, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Congressman Moore. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member and honorable members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present testimony on behalf of HR 3616, the Bear River Heritage Area Study Act. The Bear River region of northern Utah and southeastern Idaho encompasses 7 counties and approximately 13,700 square miles of rugged Rocky Mountain vistas, fertile green valleys, and Great Basin desert expanses. The region's namesake, the Bear River, stretches over 350 miles from its headwaters in eastern Utah through Wyoming and Idaho to its terminus in the Great Salt Lake, making it the longest river in North America with no natural outlet to the ocean. From pre-Columbian Native Americans to the living Shoshone nations and European fur trappers and overland pioneers of the western frontier, including modern-day immigrants, refugees, traditional artisans and apprentices, and recreationalists, the Bear River Corridor has facilitated movement and blessed an arid region with the sustenance to live. It includes 2 national wildlife refuges, 3 national forests, a national grassland, the Golden Spike National Historic Park, and the City of Rocks National Reserve. Thousands of native species and wildlife and of wildlife and plants make the area home, along with hundreds of thousands of people of diverse origins. It is these people of the Bear River and surrounding region that have unique stories, history, and folklore, and we believe that these stories and the human experiences that have written and continue to write them are worth sharing and supporting, and that partnering with the National Park Service National Heritage Area Program will allow us to harness the local interest and resources necessary to create a successful and sustainable mechanism to educate our children and visitors from across the globe. In the 20 years that Bear River Association of Governments has been associated with a heritage area activity on a local level, we have continued to work towards National Heritage Area status. Although we have already accomplished much with our invested local partners and resources, we recognize that there are still gaps to close in our ability to cohesively work together to conserve our heritage. Additional technical guidance and other resources provided by the National Park Service through National Heritage Area status would help us reach the next level in realizing the potential of our community's unique assets. We believe that the Bear River region possesses the necessary attributes to qualify for national designation, and the Bear River Heritage Area Study Act will allow for the objective measurement of the interest and dedication of the resident stakeholders of our region and gauge the probability of sustainability following data-driven informed decisions. This study will help us craft the best tools to protect private property and enterprise, promote local interpretation and presentation of the region's history, and cooperatively conserve the natural resources that are the magnificent backdrop for our society. Ultimately, House Resolution 3616 will facilitate an inventory of the rich cultural and economic heritage resources of the area and assist in the creation of a plan to leverage those resources into identifying and enhancing our natural and cultural legacy and expand the wealth building opportunities associated with our heritage that will most effectively result in the conservation and continuation for the enjoyment and enrichment of future generations. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your testimony and thank you for being here. The chair now recognizes Mr. Joseph Quinata, Chief Program Officer for the Guam Preservation Trust.
Thank you. Chairman Negos, Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the Committee of Natural Resources Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, and other distinguished members present. Hafaday, good afternoon, and good morning. The daily story of the United States of America is lived across 9 time zones that includes Guam's Chamorro Standard Time, and that I am proud to say that Guam had always had its message to the nation and to the world that this is where America's day begins. I am Joe Quinata, Chief Program Officer of the Guam Preservation Trust. I would like to introduce the Guam Preservation Trust, a nonprofit public corporation since 1990 that has been tasked to be an advocate for historic preservation and to provide opportunities for the local community to learn and gain a better sense of the history of Guam's people and places, and to carry on the legacy and tradition of Guam's cultural heritage. The vision that Guam's heritage preservation is a public responsibility through education, cooperation, and advocacy is the impetus of a movement here to preserve and protect what the local community value and commit to sustain the heritage and beauty of the island and to guard and protect it for the future. We are pleased to support H.R. 2899, an act to direct the Secretary of Interior to conduct a study to assess the suitability and feasibility of designating areas within the island of Guam as a national heritage area and for other purposes. We passionately believe the provisions and outcomes of this act aligns with our vision and mission, and as a local preservation organization with over 30 years in leading the issues of preservation, conservation, and heritage tourism, the Guam Preservation Trust hereby submit this testimony with great candor. The Guam Preservation Trust has built relationships with local, regional, and national partners in addressing issues facing Guam and the Pacific that range from the effects of climate change on natural resources and historic sites, invasive species threatening cultural heritage, and the potential direct and indirect effects to historic and cultural resources from the impending U.S. military relocation to Guam. Tourism is a key economic driver in Guam, and studies have shown that it is the local culture unique to Guam that motivates travelers who wish to experience Guam's people and their ways of life. As the local community appreciate the values of historic preservation and understand its role in economic development and the revitalization of local communities, and at the same time respecting the delicate nature of the environment, that a sustainable community will be realized. We acknowledge that the national heritage areas are designated by Congress. We also hold paramount that places that matter to us define who we are and how we continue to preserve these places that embody the memories and identity of the people of Guam as part of America's story. While we look forward to the conclusion of this study, we suggest and support a focus feature of the Lati on Guam in the Mariana Islands, the ultimate pillar and symbol of the Chamorro people in the Marianas. In closing, the Guam Preservation Trust welcome and embrace all our partners in shaping the future of Guam's heritage. In Guam, we say Siju'us Ma'asi, a genuinely warm thank you to Honorable Joe Negos, Chairman of this subcommittee, Honorable Russ Fulcher, Ranking Member, and all the members on the Committee on Natural Resources, including our Congressman, the Honorable Michael Siniclis, and other delegates from the territories, with whom we all would agree that our stories in the territories need to be heard in the overall story of America. And we are glad that this feasibility study may bring us one step closer in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We very much appreciate your kind words and thank you for your testimony. We'll now proceed into questions and want to remind members that there's a 5-minute limit on questions. I also want to let folks know, I suspect you're already aware, that votes will be called here in the next sometime between 3:45 to 4 o'clock. So we will proceed and would ask members to try to keep their questions short. Of course, they're welcome to use their entire 5 minutes, but we may need to come back after votes if that is the case. So we will start with, I'll go ahead and yield my, or skip my time for the moment, and we'll start with, I believe, is it Ranking Member Fulcher? Is Ranking Member Westerman with us?
I'm here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ranking Member Westerman, yield 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Thank you to the witnesses for testifying today on these heritage areas. Mr. Rincon, in your testimony regarding the Los Caminos del Rio heritage area along the southern border, we noticed that last night you submitted a revised or updated testimony, and we looked at it, and what you left out was this part right here. It says, "This is not to say that there are not clear and present threats which could spell out the destruction of our way of life. The most recently challenged folly has been the border wall as envisioned by Trump's Department of Homeland Security with 30-foot high bollard-style walls." Mr. Rincon, Border Patrol has seized 6,500 pounds of fentanyl already this year. That's more than in the first 6 months than all of the seizures in 2020. To put that in perspective, that's enough lethal doses of fentanyl to kill about 1.3 billion people, or 4 times the U.S. population. There's also a humanitarian crisis with young women, some as young as 12 years old, who are being sex trafficked across our border. Would you tell the families of the children that are dying due to fentanyl overdoses and the young women being sex trafficked across the border that securing our border is, quote, folly, unquote?
Sir, I would like to apologize for that comment. After submitting the first draft, I realized that this is a very touchy subject. Always when we put it in terms of the families and our communities, the priority does remain security. And a lot of my friends who do not live in the region do ask me about security. But honestly, I can only speak to my personal experience here in San Ignacio. And I suppose we owe it to the presence of the Border Patrol and our very capable local law enforcement that San Ignacio remains to be one of the most secure places I've ever lived. And some people have shared data with me about the local apprehensions. The trend.
Mr. Rincon, I'm going to have to move on here, but on August 7th, 2019, you tweeted the following from your public Twitter account in reference to Ivanka Trump. Quote, "Somebody take this dumb B-word's phone away from her. In the tweet, this expletive was actually spelled out. Mr. Rincon, this is your tweet, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah, we've got the receipt here of the tweet. Do you believe it's okay to refer to women with derogatory terms like this?
No, sir.
The website of your organization, the River Pierce Foundation, includes a mission statement that says you seek a vigorous response to callous behavior. What should your organization's vigorous response be to your own callous behavior?
Well, I will let the board of directors take that up.
Yeah, also on your Twitter page, you tweeted, the border wall is now a central monument of white supremacy in this country. Like monuments to sadistic Confederates and murderous commanders of the wars on indigenous peoples, its purpose is to announce and uphold white terror and rule. Mr. Rincon, are people who want to protect our borders from the illegal movement of weapons and drugs white supremacists?
No, I don't think so.
Are people who are concerned about the human rights abuses and humanitarian crisis happening at the border white supremacists as well?
I don't know enough to speak about that.
Well, you put it out on Twitter for the whole world to see. That's all the questions I have. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tonko for his questions.
Thank you again, Chair Neguse, for holding today's hearing. And thank you to the entire panel of witnesses for joining us and sharing their perspectives with us today. I greatly appreciate your dedicated stewardship of our cultural, historical, and natural resources. And I'm especially glad to have Ms. Sarah Capon here to help highlight my bill, H.R. 1316, the National Heritage Area Act, and the critical need to ensure that NHAs have the tools and resources necessary to succeed and benefit current and future generations. So, Ms. Capon, as you emphasized in your testimony, we face the deauthorization of 32 NHAs before the end of 2021. Can you please explain what would happen to the 32 existing national heritage areas whose authorizations are expiring if Congress fails to act?
Certainly, and thank you for that question, Mr. Tonko. I think it's important for the committee to understand the federal appropriations process, that most heritage areas are just recently receiving our FY21 funds. For example, Niagara Falls just received approval of our funding last week. So we're already 3/4 of the way through the fiscal year. And for heritage areas that are sunsetting, that means that they have to go into emergency contingency plans to basically spend down that funding in a very short period of time before they sunset, either at the end of September or in mid-October. It creates a lot of internal stress to have to go through this in terms of determining where that funding goes, but also how projects are supported afterwards. It basically leads to a shutdown and that planning. But most importantly, Mr. Tonko, is that a lot of heritage areas are experiencing this on a rotating 2-year cycle. This is something that we continue to have to go through and spend a lot of time and energy towards. Of the 30 national heritage areas that are sunsetting, most of those national heritage areas have not received their full funding appropriation, and that's another important part. So we're being evaluated on implementing a management plan that we haven't received the full federal appropriations for. So it creates a lot of crises.
Thank you. And one significant component of my National Heritage Area Act is to consolidate the authorization of sites within the system of areas so that NHAs no longer have to fight for individual reauthorizations. This would help avoid situations like the one we find ourselves in this year. So what would this consolidated authorization cycle mean for the administration, the management, and community engagement for NHAs across our country?
Well, it would be a welcome relief for uniformity. Oftentimes we have with individual reauthorizations, everybody takes an approach where they seek an individual bill. This would put us under one umbrella. And in some cases, those individual bills, some people are left out in the appropriations process. And so then there's hustling that takes place to be able to get people back under this umbrella, the safety umbrella. And so your bill creates uniformity. It creates stability for our local partners. When we're facing sunset, our local partners are facing sunset with projects that we implement alongside them. Our local municipalities that we work with are facing that as well. So it's a ripple effect that starts with the National Heritage Area, but goes out to our many 8,000 partners that we work alongside of to implement the National Park Service federal mandate.
Thank you. As such an informed voice for NHAs, what do you see as the future without the enactment of the National Heritage Area Act?
Without the enactment of the National Heritage Act, what I see is this happening on 2-year, 1-year cycles, and it's never ending. And that creates an immense fatigue and draining of energy locally. I'm not quite sure how long that we would be able to sustain our efforts, but also just the burnout that executive directors and boards and staff feel when we're trying to do the good work in our community, but spending time being able to navigate the legislative hurdles that we face in Congress. And you're going to lose good people.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for witnessing, being a witness today. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, is Mr. Rincon still with us?
I don't know. Let me.
Mr. Rincon?
Clerk, is Mr. Rincon still on the call?
He is not.
Can you hold the clock, Madam Clerk, while you're free? Thank you. Did you say he is with us?
I do not currently see him on the platform.
Okay, Mr. Fulcher, he is not.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, I'd like to at least explain.
Hold on, Mr. Fulcher. Could you restart the clock? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to go for the record and submit these questions for Mr. Rincon in hopes that he would provide a response. But like Ranking Member Westerman previously mentioned, he had submitted testimony with disparaging remarks about the border wall, then later removed them. And so my question for Mr. Rincon would have been, did a congressional staff or office instruct him to do that? And just get his response for that. I would like to know that. If so, any detail he would provide. And then why the change? Was it, does he still believe those comments, or was that no longer something that he believes? I also would like to ask Mr. Rincon if he's testifying in support of HR 2359, because he hopes that legislation will make it more difficult to construct a wall or stop construction altogether. Following that, I was going to ask Mr. Rincon if who his organization is, the River Pierce Foundation, is listed as a partner for the organization, Not Another Foot. And that publicly advocates against the border wall. And many of the posts on his public Twitter page were retweets of Not Another Foot, or their posts where they direct people to that group's website. So my question for Mr. Rincon is, what's been his organization involvement with Not Another Foot? Is there financial support that's provided for Not Another Foot? And if so, please provide any detail about that. So if there are conflicts of interest that, Mr. Chairman, that we would at least get some understanding for that. Lastly, I was going to ask Mr. Rincon that on Not Another Foot's website, which is publicly linked to his social media, there's a statement that says, tear down a giant racist monument. Chants of build the wall have accompanied incidents of racist violence across the country. The wall is a motivating symbol of the violent MAGA base that will continue to plague our society as long as it is allowed to stand. Stopping the wall will undercut the surge in anti-immigrant hatred in our country. Tell Biden to stop building the giant racist monument. So my question to him after that quote was, does he really agree with that previous statement of former President Trump supporters as a plague to society? So, Mr. Chairman, I realize it's difficult without him here. Those questions aren't for you, they're for him. But it's my hope that A, we submit those questions in the record, and B, that Mr. Rincon will give us a response to the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fulcher. And certainly those questions will be submitted to the witnesses. And under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, Mr. Fulcher, we just ask you to submit those within 3 business days following the hearing. And the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for responses from Mr. Rincon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think it's highly unfortunate that we've seen this discourse in this subcommittee in this hearing. If ever there was an area that should be nonpartisan, it should be part of our national heritage, it is national heritage areas. As I look at this particular bill, which is on the schedule in front of us, it is related to the question of whether a very from my view, incredible part of Texas should be a national heritage area. And I suppose the questioning can get to the credibility of the witness, but the questioning didn't get to the credibility of the witness's observations of what the value of that national heritage area is. And so, you know, I just would make the statement that I hope that our own national heritage is not reflected in the discourse that we've seen in this committee in the last few minutes. And with that, Ms. Capon, do you have anything you want to add to Mr. Tonko's questions and comments in the remainder of my time?
I would simply say that national heritage areas work very hard to bring all partners to the table, and we work in a common ground so that people can have the voices that are reflected in all of our stories. And I think that the testimony that we heard from members, again, reflects the home of national heritage areas. It reflects the beauty and the brilliance of our stories. It reflects place and pride, and it reflects a creative approach to how to commemorate places that don't add to the maintenance costs with the National Park Service. We don't contribute at all to that, and that we work tirelessly and nimbly within our local communities to provide a place where people can have a voice and commemorate that history that's important to who we are as Americans.
Thank you. And then one more question, Ms. Capon. Some comments were made along the lines of possible concerns with the infringement of national heritage areas on private property rights. And my understanding is that essentially national heritage areas by their conditions do not infringe on private property rights, and that Mr. Tonko's bill in fact guarantees those private property rights. Is that your understanding?
It is. So first and foremost, in Section 6 of the bill, it says nothing in this act shall be construed to abridge the rights of any property owner, whether public or private, including the right to refrain participating in any plan, project, program, or activity conducted within the national heritage area. In addition, in 2004, at the request of Congress, the General Accounting Office completed a report that stated heritage area officials, Park Service staff, and representatives of private property rights groups that were contacted were unable to provide us with any examples of a heritage area directly affecting positively or negatively private property values or use. So first and foremost, there's no history of this, but secondly, Mr. Tonko's bill outlines 9 pieces under Section 7 that address private property, with the first and foremost being that it shall not abridge the rights of any property owner.
Okay, and as the chair of the Alliance of National Heritage Areas, you're not yourself aware of any concerns from private property owners in connection with the administration of our national heritage areas?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Moore.
Hey, thank you. I'm here. Just getting my camera going. Again, Mr. Carver, Brian, thank you for being here. I'm like I mentioned in my opening comments, our team is really excited to work collaboratively with the local group. It means the world, and I hope that carries and is shown through to the powers that be to get this legislation through. Let me just got a couple questions for you. Can you provide us with some insight about the grassroots support? So I've talked about it a little bit, but the grassroots support that exists for this Bear River National Heritage Study Act?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned in my testimony, this is a project that our office has been supporting for 20 years now, and we've been working very closely with elected officials in both the counties and cities and towns of Utah and Idaho. We've worked with visitors and convention bureaus. We have very close relationships with both the state of Idaho and state of Utah and their historic preservation divisions. We have made continuous efforts over the years to reach out as elected bodies change and transition from year to year. We work to continue to build awareness of our existence, of our activities and the programs and services that we've offered in the past, and make sure that we have those relationships of communication and hopefully trust between us and the community leaders and the organizations that are making the effectual change towards identifying and preserving the culture.
Could you also juxtapose the difference between, you know, what you've been able to accomplish as a locally recognized heritage organization and what would the national designation, why is that such an important goal? Just given the difference between those two.
Yes, sir. While we are proud of the accomplishments that we've been able to achieve as a local organization, which include a variety of award-winning publications, including business and event directories, tours, self-guided travel tours for visitors to the area, and books celebrating the historic architecture and crafts of the area. We have struggled, honestly, with financial and administrative stability. We believe that the technical and financial resources provided by national designation will provide us with the platform, really, from which we can launch a more sustainable organization that is capable of fully leveraging the network of stakeholders that we've built. We welcome a sustainability plan and the concept of a sunsetting program and sunsetting federal financial assistance does not intimidate us. And we are confident that a feasibility study will demonstrate that we have that foundational story to tell and the network to tell it.
Anything you'd add as you bring up the feasibility study? Anything you would add as some of the most important considerations? What should we be keeping in mind with respect to that?
Well, honestly, I think the most important aspects that we want to focus on in the feasibility study is that fiscal sustainability. We need to continue to strengthen the partnerships that we have with our private partners, as this is a public and private partnership effort, to make sure that the support is there to continue to provide resources once the federal government's role has been completed. At this point, as I said, we've been working on this for 20 years. I think we already have a lot of the information in place necessary to demonstrate the feasibility from the Park Service's point of view of a significant national story to tell. I think at this point we are just working through the steps necessary to finalize our organizational structure and build towards that sustainable future.
Let me add a personal note as I wrap up here about some of the lesser known stories and some of the stories that this will tell. I ended up in a general election against an individual named Darren Perry, who's a council member for the Shoshone Nation, northern part of Utah, southern part of Idaho. And there's the Bear River Massacre site would be in this. I got to speak at that a few months after the election against my Democrat opponent, where we came together, and this is a way of continuing on that relationship that we built during the campaign. In my opinion, the way we should be doing a lot of things. and it was an honor. But I didn't know about the Bear River Massacre to the level of detail, and I grew up in northern Utah until I had a chance to go speak at that when I was 40 years old. This is an opportunity to make sure that awareness comes to things like that, recreational area, and the Golden Spike, which again, I'll admit is one of the most important fundamental things to our nation. So I'll pause there and yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Audio working?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I too had questions for Mr. Rincon, and I have to say that I'm rather disappointed that he's no longer joining the committee, which I think is another example of why we should have these meetings face to face. Quite frankly, I think it would be very difficult for someone to just get up in the middle of a hearing and sort of walk out. So what I was going to say is to quote his statement from January 19th of this year, when he directed his Twitter followers to sign a petition that was, and I quote, "close to your heart." This petition stated that the border wall was fueling violent racism, and that for Trump's most violent supporters, the wall is their single greatest symbol of inspiration, one that fuels violent racist attacks across our country, end quote. I would ask Mr. Rincon, do you agree with the characterization that all people who support secure borders are racist, and are all of President Trump's supporters violent and racist as well? And then after that, I would follow up with another question. According to data from ICE, illegal aliens arrested last year had an average of 4 criminal convictions or pending charges each. If there are concerns about violent crime, why isn't Mr. Rincon circulating petitions to step up border enforcement and stop dangerous illegal immigrants from entering our country? Next, I would ask Mr. Rincon about a tweet that he recently retweeted that said, in reference to the construction equipment being used to secure our borders, "It sure was nice to see these death machines parked and immobile today. The ones we've seen every day cutting an irreversible scar into our borderlands. At POTUS must cancel all contracts for good so they're never used again. Also, at Caterpillar Inc. profits from ecocide. Never forget," end quote. So I would ask Mr. Rincon, how do you define ecocide, and in what way is this ecocide? And then finally, I would close, Mr. Rincon, under the Biden administration, Border Patrol has encountered well over 600,000 aliens attempting to enter our country illegally. We know that on average, each illegal alien discards between 6 to 8 pounds of trash when entering our country illegally. Would you consider the millions of pounds of trash discarded along the border due to the Biden administration ecocide? Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, I will yield the balance of my time back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield the balance of my time to the ranker, Mr. Westerman, if he needs some additional time.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that with due respect, I want to clarify that the questioning of Mr. Rincon is germane to this hearing, because he referenced the border wall in testimony that we had 4 days before he pulled that. And furthermore, the majority has been strongly encouraging every witness before this committee to fill out a witness diversity survey. The majority opened the door to wokeness, and it's only fair now that we should be able to point out when you're about a witness with a history of deeply concerning and problematic statements and tweets. And generally speaking, the people who are chosen to testify before a committee represent the views of the party that asked them to come and testify. And I realize that there's been anti-Semitic, there's been racist language that's been tolerated by the Democrat Party, but I would respectfully ask that for future witnesses, that you not invite witnesses who disparage women and classify Americans who are supporters of the border wall as racist or worse. And I yield back to the gentleman from Montana.
Mr. Chair, I would yield back my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I have not exercised my 5 minutes of questioning, but I will just simply say I take great offense with respect to some of what the ranking member Westerman just said. I don't think that I made any comments with respect to the relevancy of your line of questioning at all during the course of this hearing. So to the extent that that was directed at me, I would hope that you would clarify that for the record. Obviously,
if the gentleman will yield, that was I think it was Mr. Case that made those statements. It wasn't you, Mr. Chairman.
I have not yielded my time. So regardless, as I said previously, certainly are welcome to deliver those questions to the witness, whom I understand the majority staff continues to contact and is not receiving any response. So, but in any event, that witness was not selected by me or my office, and was here to testify on a particular bill for a particular member. But in any event, I will simply say you've asked your questions, and as I said to Ranking Member Fulcher of the subcommittee, we'll certainly endeavor to make sure that those questions are submitted, and we'll hold the committee record open for 10 business days so that we can ensure that responses are received. With that, I will yield the balance of my time. The chair will recognize Mr. Gomer if he is available.
Thanks so much. Well, I did have a question for Mr. Rincon based on his testimony, and I really appreciate the chair making sure that he gets these questions. But in his original testimony, he said the most recently challenged folly has been the border wall as envisioned by the Trump Department of Homeland Security with 30-foot high bollard style walls. And so anyway, I would like to hear exactly why he believes that the border wall was a folly. I mean, obviously, the Speaker of the House believes in fences and walls because she had two put around the Capitol. So surely she would not have had fences as tall as they were around the Capitol unless she believed they could be effective. So I was wanting to know from Mr. Rincon why that was that he believed that was such folly. But it's been a long hearing, and I appreciate your patience, Mr. Chairman. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Gomer. The chair, I believe we are all out of members, but I want to take a moment to make sure that we're not skipping anybody. And so I'm going to leave it open here for a minute. If there are any Democratic majority or minority members of the subcommittee or any of the members who were granted unanimous consent to appear for this particular hearing who would like to pose any questions. Okay, with that, I want to say again, thank you to the witnesses for their testimony. I want to thank all of the members for their questions. As we've talked about at great length, the members of the committee may have and indeed do have additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask each of the witnesses who participated in today's hearing to respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and would certainly ask any members who have posed such questions today to do so in writing for the record. And then the hearing record will be held open, as I said previously, for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.